What's cracking my tired little noodle? Is it just me, or was today a decade long, like seriously dragging? Anyways, let's sit around our imaginary pillow fort, and let me tell you a story here tonight, where we step back into a time when baseball was played in the afternoon sunlight, when the crack of a wooden bat echoed through neighbourhoods, and when one man transformed not just a sport, but the very idea of what it meant to be a hero in America. This is the story of George Herman Ruth, though the world would come to know him by a different name entirely. If you're new here, as always, joining the community is super quick and easy. Just tap subscribe and like the video, and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now find that cold part of your pillow and let's start. Imagine Baltimore in 1895, when the city's waterfront hummed with the sounds of industry, and immigrant voices mixed with the calls of street vendors selling everything from fresh oysters to yesterday's newspapers. The air carried the smell of coal smoke, horse manure, and the briny tang of the Chesapeake Bay. Into this world on February 6th, George Herman Ruth Jr. was born above his father's saloon on Frederic Street, in a neighbourhood that polite society preferred to pretend didn't exist. The Baltimore waterfront district wasn't the kind of place where childhood dreams were supposed to flourish. It was rough, loud, and unforgiving, a place where kids grew up fast or didn't grow up at all. Young George's parents, Kate and George Sr., ran a combination saloon and boarding house, which meant their home was always filled with the sounds of adult conversations, the clink of glasses, and the occasional argument that spilled out onto the cobblestone streets. For a small boy in this environment, normal supervision was nearly impossible. Kate Ruth was often ill, weakened by the demands of running a business and bearing 8 children, only 2 of whom would survive infancy. George Sr. worked from dawn until late into the night, managing a business that catered to dock workers, sailors, and the sort of customers who didn't ask too many questions about the quality of the whiskey. Young George found himself largely raising himself on those Baltimore streets. By the time he was 7, he was spending more time in the alleys and corners of the waterfront than in school. He'd skip classes to hang around the docks, watching longshoremen unload cargo from ships that had travelled from places he could barely imagine. Sometimes he'd steal fruit from vendor carts, not always because he was hungry, but because the thrill of not getting caught was more exciting than anything happening in a classroom. The trouble started small: truancy, petty theft, the kind of mischief that city police generally ignored when it came from waterfront kids. But it escalated. George had energy that seemed to vibrate through his small frame, an inability to sit still that drove his teachers to distraction on the rare occasions he showed up to school. He needed to be moving, doing, and challenging himself in ways that the rigid structure of turn-of-the-century education couldn't accommodate. His parents watched their son's trajectory with the kind of helpless concern that comes from being too overwhelmed to intervene effectively. Kate's illness worsened. The saloon demanded constant attention. Their other surviving child, George's younger sister Mary, required care. Something had to give, and that something turned out to be young George's presence in their daily lives. In 1902, when George was just 7 years old, his parents made a decision that would alter the course of American sports history, though they certainly didn't know it at the time. They signed papers declaring him incorrigible and committed him to St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys, a reformatory and orphanage run by the Catholic Severian Brothers on the outskirts of Baltimore. You might picture this moment as traumatic: a young boy torn from his family and sent away to an institution. But the truth was more complicated. George would later describe his arrival at St. Mary's not as a punishment, but as the first real stability he'd ever known. The reformatory had rules, yes, but it also had structure, regular meals, and adults who actually paid attention to what the boys were doing. St. Mary's was enormous, housing over 800 boys on a campus that sprawled across industrial Baltimore's western edge. The buildings were imposing, red brick structures that looked like they'd been designed to remind young boys of their insignificance. But within those walls, George discovered something that had been missing from his chaotic life on Frederic Street: predictability. Every day at St. Mary's followed the same rhythm. Wake at 6, morning prayers, breakfast, classes in reading, writing and arithmetic, afternoon sessions learning trades, shoemaking, tailoring and printing, more prayers, dinner, evening recreation, lights out. For a boy whose previous life had been defined by chaos and uncertainty, this routine was surprisingly comforting, like finally hearing a melody after years of nothing but noise. The Xaverian brothers who ran the school were stern but not cruel. They believed in discipline, hard work, and the redemptive power of the Catholic faith. They also believed in baseball. Behind the main buildings, St. Mary's maintained several baseball diamonds where boys could play nearly every day, weather permitting. This was where George Herman Ruth would discover the game that would define his existence. Picture those baseball fields at St. Mary's on a late spring afternoon, with the sun beginning its slow descent behind Baltimore's skyline. The grass, kept reasonably well by boys assigned to groundskeeping duties, stretched out in a shade of green that looked almost luminous in the golden light. The base paths were hard-packed dirt worn smooth by hundreds of running feet. The smell of leather gloves worn soft with use, mixed with the earthy scent of infield dust kicked up by sliding runners. This was where young George found his calling, though he didn't recognise it as such at first. Baseball at St. Mary's wasn't a formal sport with scholarships and professional scouts. It was recreation, a way to burn off the restless energy of hundreds of boys who needed something to do besides contemplating their various failures that had led them to a reformatory. At first, George was just another kid trying to figure out where he fit in the rotating cast of games that seemed to run continuously, from spring through fall. St. Mary's had multiple teams, organised by age and ability, and boys cycled through different positions based on who showed up and who was serving detention for some infraction of the school's numerous rules. George tried catching first, squatting behind a home plate with a rudimentary mask and chest protector that offered minimal protection against foul tips and wild pitches. He discovered he liked being in the middle of every play, calling pitches, though the pitchers often ignored him, and occasionally throwing out runners who were foolish enough to test his arm, but it was pitching that truly captured his imagination. One afternoon, when the regular pitcher for his team was sick in the infirmary, George volunteered. He'd watched pitchers enough to understand the basic mechanics, the wind-up, the stride, and the follow-through. What he discovered when he towed the rubber for the first time was that throwing a baseball hard was one of the most satisfying physical experiences he'd ever encountered. The ball left his left hand. He was naturally left-handed, which was still considered vaguely suspicious in turn-of-the-century America, and sailed toward home plate with surprising velocity. The batter swung and missed. George felt something click into place, like a puzzle piece he hadn't known was missing suddenly completing a picture. Over the following months and years, George threw and threw and threw. He developed calluses on his fingers from gripping the ball's raised seams. His left shoulder ached most evenings, a dull throb that felt like achievement rather than injury. He studied the older pitchers at St. Mary's, watching how they varied their speeds, how they used the batter's expectations against him, and how they worked both sides of the plate to keep hitters off balance. Brother Matthias Boutelier, the school's prefect of discipline and unofficial athletics director, noticed the skinny kid who seemed to live on the baseball diamond. Matthias was an imposing figure, over 6 feet tall, and built like the longshoreman George remembered from the waterfront. But unlike the rough men of Baltimore's docks, Matthias combined physical presence with genuine interest in the boys under his supervision. Matthias took George under his wing in a way that the boy's actual father never had. He taught him not just baseball mechanics, but also the mental aspects of the game, how to read a batter's stance, how to recognise when someone was guessing fastball, and how to use the umpire's strike zone to his advantage. More importantly, Matthias gave George something he'd rarely experienced: consistent attention from an adult who believed he might actually amount to something. As George moved through his teenage years at St. Mary's, cycling in and out of the institution as his father periodically tried to bring him home before inevitably sending him back, baseball became his constant. The game didn't care about his rough background or his trouble with authority or his inability to sit still in a classroom. Baseball rewarded his natural athleticism, his surprising coordination, and his competitive fire that burned hot enough to make him practice long after other boys had gone inside. By his mid-teens, George had developed a reputation that extended beyond St Mary's walls. Local amateur teams would sometimes recruit St Mary's players for weekend games, and George's name started appearing in the sports pages of Baltimore newspapers, usually just a line or two noting that the St Mary's pitcher had struck out a dozen batters in some industrial league matchup. He was still raw, still learning, still prone to the kind of wildness both on and off the field that made him simultaneously exciting and unpredictable. But something was emerging in the lanky teenager with the round face and surprisingly quick reflexes, a talent that would soon catch the attention of people who recognised potential when they saw it. On a crisp February morning in 1914, 19-year-old George Herman Ruth signed his first professional baseball contract with the Baltimore Orioles of the International League. The contract paid him $600 for the season, which was more money than George had ever imagined having. To put that in perspective, the average American worker at the time earned less than $400 annually. George was suddenly, improbably, well paid. The Orioles' owner and manager, Jack Dunn, had watched George pitch for St Mary's and saw something that went beyond mere skill. He saw a young man with a left arm that could make baseballs do things that defied easy explanation, combined with an enthusiasm for the game that bordered on childlike joy. Dunn became George's legal guardian, a formality required because George was still technically under St Mary's jurisdiction, and the other players started calling the newest addition to the team Dunn's new babe. The nickname stuck, though it would be shortened and transformed in the years ahead. But for now, George was just trying to figure out how to be a professional baseball player, which turned out to involve a lot more than just throwing strikes. Professional baseball in 1914 bore little resemblance to the modern game you might watch on a lazy summer evening. Teams travelled by train, staying in modest hotels where players doubled up in rooms that were stuffy in summer and frigid in winter. Uniforms were heavy wool that absorbed sweat and never quite dried out during long road trips. Gloves were thin leather affairs that offered minimal protection, and players who didn't learn to catch the ball properly ended up with broken fingers that never quite healed right. George threw himself into this life with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else. He loved the trains, the hotels, and the constant motion from city to city. After years of institutional confinement at St Mary's, the freedom of professional baseball felt intoxicating. He could stay up late, eat what he wanted, and spend his money on whatever caught his fancy, usually food, as George had developed an appetite that his teammates found simultaneously impressive and slightly alarming. His pitching developed rapidly under professional coaching. George learned to add a curveball to his fastball, giving him two pitches that worked off each other beautifully. The curve would start at a batter's shoulder and break down across the plate, while his fastball came in straight and hard. Batters had to choose what they were looking for, and George was getting good enough at reading swings that he usually guessed right about what they'd chosen. But George's time with the Orioles was brief. The team was struggling financially, a common problem for minor league clubs, and by July, Jack Dunn had sold his best young pitcher to the Boston Red Sox for a sum that seemed enormous at the time, but would later look like one of history's great bargains. George Herman Ruth, just 5 months into his professional career, was heading to the major leagues. Boston in 1914 was a baseball city in a way that's hard to imagine today. The Red Sox played their home games at Fenway Park, which had opened just 2 years earlier and still smelled of fresh paint and optimism. The park was intimate, with fans sitting close enough to the field that you could hear them commenting on your pitching mechanics between deliveries. George spent most of his first season shuttling between Boston and their minor league affiliate in Providence, Rhode Island. The Red Sox weren't sure what they had in this rough-edged kid from Baltimore. He could clearly pitch. His statistics left no doubt about that. But he was also undisciplined, prone to breaking curfew, and possessed of an appetite for nightlife that worried his more conservative managers. The 1915 season marked George's emergence as one of baseball's premier left-handed pitchers. He won 18 games, posted an earned run average that placed him among the league's best, and helped pitch the Red Sox into the World Series. In the Fall Classic against the Philadelphia Phillies, George appeared in one game, pitching well enough that his manager trusted him with important innings. Boston won the championship, and 19-year-old George Herman Ruth received his first World Series ring. He celebrated with the enthusiasm you'd expect from a teenager who'd gone from a Baltimore reformatory to the pinnacle of professional sports in just over a year. The parties lasted for days, and George's capacity for both celebration and recovery became legendary among his teammates. The next few seasons established a pattern. George would pitch brilliantly, winning 23 games in 1916 and 24 in 1917, while simultaneously testing every rule and boundary his managers tried to impose. He'd disappear after games, showing up the next day with mysterious bruises and implausible explanations. He'd miss team trains, forcing managers to fine him from his paycheck. He'd argue with umpires, fight with opposing players, and generally behave like someone who had never quite internalised society's expectations for professional behaviour, yet he kept winning. In the 1916 World Series against the Brooklyn Robins, George pitched 14 innings of shutout baseball in Game 2, setting a World Series record that would stand for decades. The Red Sox won again, giving George his second championship ring before his 22nd birthday. But something else was happening during these seasons, something that would ultimately prove more significant than his pitching achievements. When George wasn't on the mound, he'd occasionally play outfield or fill in at first base, and when he played these positions, he got to bat more than the once every 4-day schedule that pitchers followed. When George batted, remarkable things happened. The ball would leave his bat with a sound that was different from normal contact, a sharp crack that seemed to carry its own echo. The ball would rise on trajectories that looked almost leisurely until you realised how far they were travelling. Home runs in the dead ball era were rare, but George was hitting them with alarming regularity whenever his managers let him swing the bat. By 1918, Red Sox management faced an unusual problem. Their best pitcher was also potentially their best hitter. George appeared in 95 games that season, pitching in only 20 of them. He won 13 games on the mound while simultaneously leading the American League with 11 home runs, a total that would have been unremarkable in later eras but was extraordinary for the time. The baseball world was beginning to recognise that George Herman Ruth might be something unprecedented. Not just a great player, but someone who was redefining what great could mean. Picture Boston's Fenway Park in late 1919, as autumn settled over New England and the baseball season wound toward its conclusion. George Herman Ruth, now 24 years old, had just completed his most remarkable season yet. 29 home runs, shattering every previous record for a single season. He'd effectively stopped pitching, playing almost exclusively as an outfielder, where he could bat every day rather than once every 4 games. The Red Sox owner, Harry Frazee, watched this transformation with mixed feelings. On one hand, Ruth's hitting had made him arguably the most exciting player in baseball. On the other hand, Frazee was primarily a theatrical producer who'd bought the Red Sox almost on a whim, and the team was losing money faster than Frazee could generate it from his Broadway investments. Meanwhile, in New York, the Yankees were baseball's also-ran franchise. They shared the Polo Grounds with the Giants, playing second fiddle in their own city, and consistently finishing somewhere in the middle of the American League standings. Yankees ownership wanted to change this dynamic, and they had the financial resources that Frazee desperately needed. The negotiations happened quietly, over dinner meetings in Manhattan restaurants where the wealthy discussed business deals over steaks and bourbon. Frazee needed cash to finance his theatrical productions and pay off debts that were threatening to sink both his baseball and Broadway enterprises. Yankees owners wanted the player who was transforming baseball from a game of singles and stolen bases into something far more dramatic. On December 26, 1919, the day after Christmas, when most Americans were still digesting holiday meals and exchanging gifts, the news broke. The Boston Red Sox had sold George Herman Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees for $100,000 in cash, plus a loan of $300,000 secured by a mortgage on Fenway Park. The reaction in Boston ranged from disbelief to fury. Newspaper editorials condemned Frazee for sacrificing baseball success to finance his theatrical ambitions. Fans gathered outside Fenway Park in the December cold, some crying, others threatening to never attend another Red Sox game. The term curse hadn't yet entered the vocabulary, but the sense that something fundamentally wrong had occurred was palpable. George himself learned about the trade from reporters who called his apartment, waking him from an afternoon nap. His initial reaction was less emotional than practical. He immediately called the Yankees owner to renegotiate his contract, recognizing that his new team clearly valued him more than his old one had. The Yankees agreed to double his salary, making George Herman Ruth baseball's highest paid player at $20,000 per year. New York in January 1920 felt like a different planet from Boston. The city was louder, brasher, and more chaotic, more like the Baltimore waterfront of George's childhood than the relatively restrained environment of New England. Broadway blazed with electric lights, jazz music poured from basement clubs, and Prohibition had just taken effect, which meant speakeasies were opening faster than authorities could shut them down. George took to New York the way a duck takes to water. He discovered that the city's nightlife suited his temperament perfectly. After games, he'd hit the clubs, order enormous meals, charm showgirls, and generally behave like someone who'd been let out of a cage he hadn't realized he'd been living in. His appetites for food, drink, female company, and general revelry became as legendary as his home runs. But what really mattered happened at the polo grounds between the chalk lines. George's first season in New York redefined what was possible in baseball. He hit 54 home runs, nearly doubling his previous record. To put this in perspective, no other player in the American League hit more than 19. George alone hit more home runs than entire teams combined. The style of these home runs captivated audiences in ways that the technical excellence of pitching or the strategic complexity of manufacturing runs never could. When George connected with a pitch, the ball didn't just clear the fence, it soared into territories that seemed to violate the normal physics of baseball. Balls landed in distant bleachers, bounced onto the streets outside stadiums, and occasionally vanished entirely, presumably captured by fans as souvenirs worth more than the price of admission. Newspapers struggled to describe what Ruth was doing. Sports writers exhausted their vocabularies trying to convey the arc of his home runs, the power in his swing, and the childlike joy he displayed while rounding the bases. They started calling him the Bambino, the Sultan of Swat, and simply the Babe, names that captured both his dominance and the affection that fans felt for this oversized personality. The Yankees recognized that they had something unprecedented, and they began planning to build their own stadium. The Polo Grounds belonged to the Giants, and Yankees ownership wanted a venue they controlled, one designed to showcase their most valuable asset. The planning and construction would take time, but the vision was clear. A cathedral to baseball, and specifically to the particular brand of baseball that Babe Ruth represented. Imagine standing outside Yankee Stadium on opening day, April 18th, 1923. The structure rising before you represents the largest baseball stadium ever built. Over 58,000 seats, arrayed in 3 decks that seem to reach toward the clouds. The facade along the roof features ornamental copperwork that catches the spring sunlight. The grass looks impossibly green, maintained by groundskeepers who treat the field like a golf course. This is the house that Ruth built, though technically it was built for Ruth. The stadium's design reflected its primary purpose, showcasing Babe Ruth's home runs. The right field fence stood just 295 feet from home plate, a distance that seemed designed specifically for Ruth's left-handed swing. The dimensions were asymmetrical, reflecting the irregular plot of land in the Bronx where the Yankees had chosen to build, but those asymmetries worked in Ruth's favour. Ruth christened the new stadium in the most appropriate way possible, with a home run in the first game, a 3-run shot that gave the Yankees a lead they never relinquished. The newspapers the next day declared that Ruth had consecrated the new venue, and the nickname "the house that Ruth built" appeared in print for the first time. The 1923 season marked the Yankees' first World Series championship, with Ruth batting .368 in the Fall Classic against the New York Giants. After nearly a decade of championships with the Red Sox, Ruth had finally delivered a title to his new team, validating the enormous investment the Yankees had made in acquiring him. The next several years established a pattern that would define the Yankees for generations. Ruth would put up statistics that seemed to belong in fantasy rather than reality. In 1927, he hit 60 home runs, a total so absurd that it would stand as the single-season record for 34 years. His teammates, particularly Lou Gehrig batting behind him in the lineup, benefited from the attention pitchers paid to Ruth, forming what sports writers called Murderer's Row. But Ruth's impact extended beyond statistics. He transformed baseball from a regional interest into a national obsession. Radio broadcasts carried Yankees games across the country, with Ruth's at-bats creating a sense of anticipation that built with each pitch. Movie newsreels featured Ruth's home runs, showing audiences in small-town theatres what this larger-than-life figure was doing in New York. Children across America started imitating Ruth's distinctive swing, the big leg kick, the powerful hip rotation, and the follow-through that lifted his back foot off the ground. Youth baseball teams shifted their emphasis from bunting and base running to swinging for the fences, fundamentally changing how the game was taught. Ruth was creating a new generation of baseball fans who viewed home runs not as occasional flukes, but as the ultimate expression of the sport. The money followed the success. Ruth's salary increased to $80,000 by 1930, making him better paid than President Herbert Hoover. When someone pointed out this disparity, Ruth reportedly replied that he'd had a better year than Hoover, a quip that captured both his ego and the genuine affection Americans felt for him even during the Depression's early years. Off the field, Ruth's lifestyle became as legendary as his hitting. He'd order room service meals designed for 4 people and eat them alone. He'd stay out until dawn, charming reporters and fellow revellers with stories told in his distinctive gravelly voice. He'd show up to the stadium looking like he'd slept in his clothes, which he sometimes had, and then proceed to hit home runs that left fans wondering if dissipation somehow improved his performance. His managers despaired of controlling him. Ruth would violate curfews, skip team meetings, and generally behave like someone for whom normal rules didn't apply. In 1925, his lifestyle caught up with him. He collapsed during spring training with what newspapers politely called the bellyache heard around the world, though the reality involved a combination of overeating, drinking, and general excess that landed him in the hospital for weeks. That season, Ruth's worst in the majors served as a warning. He hit just 25 home runs and the Yankees finished in 7th place. Ruth recognised that even his prodigious talent had limits, and he moderated his behaviour enough to bounce back in 1926 with 47 home runs and a return to the World Series. The late 1920s and early 1930s marked the peak of Ruth's dominance. He won home run titles, led the league in runs batted in, and posted batting averages that would have been impressive even without the power numbers. The Yankees won championships in 1927, 1928 and 1932, with Ruth as their undisputed centerpiece. The 1932 World Series against the Chicago Cubs produced what would become Ruth's most famous moment, the called shot in Game 3. With the score tied and Cubs players and fans heckling him mercilessly, Ruth stepped to the plate. He pointed toward the center field bleachers, or at the Cubs pitcher, or maybe was just gesturing generally, depending on which account you believe, and then hit the next pitch exactly where he'd indicated, a majestic home run that silenced Wrigley Field. Whether Ruth actually called his shot remains debated by historians. What's undeniable is that the moment perfectly captured who Ruth was, confident to the point of arrogance, theatrical, and capable of backing up even his most outrageous gestures with actual performance. The legend mattered more than the literal truth, and the legend was that Ruth had promised a home run and then delivered it exactly as advertised. As evening settles around you and your tea grows cooler, let's pause to consider what Babe Ruth was actually like as a person, separate from the legend that grew up around his accomplishments. Ruth stood 6'2", which was tall for his era, with a barrel chest, spindly legs, and a face that photographers described as lived in. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but his features conveyed warmth and openness that made people instinctively like him. His nose had been broken multiple times, testimony to his rough upbringing and occasional propensity for bar fights in his younger days. His voice was surprisingly high and gravelly, the result of years of cigars and whiskey. When he laughed, which was often, it was a full-body experience that started in his belly and emerged as a sound that friends described as infectious. People who met Ruth invariably commented on his energy. He couldn't sit still, constantly fidgeting, moving, and looking for the next thing to engage his attention. Ruth's relationship with children revealed a side of his personality that the public especially loved. He'd spend hours signing autographs for kids who waited outside stadiums, never seeming to tire of the attention. When he visited children's hospitals, which he did regularly, usually without inviting press coverage, he'd sit with sick kids telling them stories and making them laugh. These visits weren't publicity stunts. Ruth genuinely enjoyed making children happy in ways that suggested he was trying to give them experiences he'd never had in his own difficult childhood. His generosity was legendary and somewhat indiscriminate. Ruth would tip waiters $50 for bringing him a sandwich, hand $100 bills to doormen, and loan money to teammates who he knew would never pay him back. This largesse wasn't entirely altruistic. Ruth enjoyed the feeling of power that came from being able to help others, but it also reflected a genuine disinterest in accumulating wealth for its own sake. His first marriage, to a woman named Helen Woodford whom he'd met while playing in Boston, had ended tragically when Helen died in a house fire in 1929. Ruth remarried almost immediately to a former actress and model named Claire Hodgson, who brought a stabilising influence that Ruth's life had previously lacked. Claire managed Ruth's finances, organised his schedule, and generally tried to impose order on the chaos that naturally surrounded him. Claire also brought her daughter Julia into Ruth's life, and Ruth embraced fatherhood with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else. He'd play catch with Julia in the backyard of their apartment building, teach her to hit off a batting tee, and tell her stories about his games that always made him seem just slightly more heroic than he actually had been. Ruth's relationship with Lou Gehrig, his longtime teammate, was complicated. The two men were opposites in almost every way. Ruth loud and undisciplined, Gehrig quiet and methodical. They produced one of baseball's most productive lineup combinations, but personally they maintained a distance that occasionally erupted into outright hostility. A falling out in the early 1930s, reportedly over a comment Claire Ruth made about Gehrig's mother, resulted in years where the two barely spoke despite playing on the same team. As Ruth aged, his body began showing the accumulated effects of decades of excess. His once powerful legs thinned, making him slower in the outfield and on the base paths. His reflexes, while still exceptional, no longer allowed him to catch up to the fastest pitches. By the mid-1930s, it was becoming clear that even Babe Ruth couldn't hit forever. The Yankees, with typical corporate efficiency, began planning for a future without their greatest star. They acquired younger outfielders, gave Ruth fewer plate appearances, and generally treated him like a depreciating asset rather than the man who'd built their dynasty. Ruth wanted to manage, believing his baseball knowledge and personality would make him an effective leader. Yankees management disagreed, seeing Ruth's lack of discipline as disqualifying him from a position that required organisation and restraint. In 1935, the Yankees sold Ruth to the Boston Braves, where he was promised a player-manager role that never quite materialised. Instead, Ruth found himself playing for a terrible team, struggling to connect with pitches that would have been routine outs just a few years earlier. His body, after years of abuse, was finally giving out. Ruth's final games as a player were simultaneously sad and somehow fitting. In Pittsburgh on May 25, 1935, he hit 3 home runs in a single game, the last of which cleared the right field stands at Forbes Field and landed outside the stadium, the first fair ball ever hit completely out of that park. It was a reminder of what Ruth had been, a final flash of the power that had defined his career. 6 days later, Ruth played his last game. He went hitless, looked slow and old, and left the field knowing his playing career was over. He officially retired on June 2nd, 1935, ending a 22-year career that had transformed American sports. The years after retirement were difficult for Ruth in ways that his playing career never had been. He'd defined himself through baseball for so long that existence without the daily rhythm of games left him feeling unmoored. The Yankees never offered him the managerial position he coveted, and other teams were similarly uninterested in hiring someone they viewed as too undisciplined to lead. Ruth tried various ventures. He coached briefly for the Brooklyn Dodgers, appeared in exhibition games, and took roles in Hollywood films that required him to essentially play himself. But none of these activities filled the void that baseball's absence had created. He was like a shark that needed to keep moving to breathe, except now the water had been drained from his tank. He remained popular with the public, his name still capable of drawing crowds wherever he appeared. He'd attend charity events, sign autographs, and tell stories about his playing days that grew more embellished with each retelling. The real Babe Ruth was gradually being replaced by the legend, a process that Ruth himself seemed to encourage. World War II gave Ruth a renewed sense of purpose. He participated in war bond drives, visited military hospitals, and played in exhibition games designed to boost morale. Soldiers who'd grown up idolising Ruth got to meet their hero, and Ruth seemed genuinely moved by their appreciation. These interactions suggested that Ruth's importance transcended baseball. He'd become a symbol of American vitality and confidence that resonated during wartime. On April 27, 1947, the Yankees retired Ruth's number 3, making it the first number ever retired in baseball. Over 50,000 fans packed Yankee Stadium for Babe Ruth Day, celebrating the man who had made the venue famous. Ruth, already ill with throat cancer, though the public didn't know it yet, spoke briefly to the crowd in a voice ravaged by disease. A famous photograph from that day shows Ruth leaning on a bat for support, his body wasted by illness, but his presence still commanding. The cancer progressed rapidly. Ruth spent much of 1948 in and out of hospitals, undergoing treatments that were primitive by modern standards and largely ineffective. He lost weight dramatically, his once powerful frame reduced to something that friends described as heartbreaking to witness. But even in decline, Ruth maintained the essential qualities that had defined him: optimism, humour, and a refusal to complain about his circumstances. On August 16, 1948, Babe Ruth died at age 53. His body lay in state at Yankee Stadium, where over 100,000 people filed past to pay their respects. The line stretched for blocks, filled with people of all ages who wanted one final moment with the man who had given them so many memories. The funeral itself was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan, with over 6,000 people inside and thousands more on the streets outside. Ruth was buried at Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York. His grave became, and remains, one of the most visited sites in American sports, a pilgrimage destination for fans who want to connect with baseball's past. Now, as you settle deeper into your blankets and perhaps close your eyes, consider what Ruth left behind. His lifetime statistics, 714 home runs, a .342 batting average, and 2,013 runs batted in, were records that would stand for decades. But numbers alone don't capture his impact. Ruth transformed baseball from a sport played primarily in small markets to a truly national phenomenon. Before Ruth, baseball struggled to compete with boxing and horse racing for public attention. After Ruth, baseball was unquestionably America's game, a status it would maintain for the better part of a century. He changed how the game was played, shifting emphasis from small ball tactics to power hitting. Managers who had spent careers teaching bunts and hit-and-run plays suddenly found themselves encouraging batters to swing for the fences. The entire architecture of offense was rebuilt around the home run, a change that Ruth essentially accomplished single-handedly. Ruth proved that athletes could be celebrities in ways previously reserved for actors and politicians. His salary negotiations set precedents for athlete compensation. His endorsement deals created a template for how sports stars could leverage fame into wealth. His lifestyle, while excessive, demonstrated that public figures could survive scandal through sheer charisma and performance. The cultural impact extended beyond sports. Ruth became a symbol of American possibility. The idea that someone from the worst circumstances could rise to the absolute pinnacle of success. His story resonated especially during the Depression years, when Americans needed heroes who proved that the system could still work, that talent and determination could still overcome poverty and limited opportunity. Ruth's relationship with children created a template for how sports stars interact with young fans. The image of Ruth visiting sick children, signing endless autographs, and treating kids with genuine affection established expectations for athlete behaviour that persist today. Every modern athlete who visits a children's hospital is, in some way, following the path Ruth created. His flaws were as legendary as his achievements, and paradoxically, those flaws made him more beloved rather than less. Americans appreciated that Ruth enjoyed his success, that he indulged appetites rather than pretending they didn't exist. There was something honest about Ruth's excesses that stood in stark contrast to the carefully managed public images that other celebrities cultivated. The Yankees dynasty that Ruth created continued for decades after his retirement. The team won championships through the 1950s and beyond, but all of those successes built on the foundation Ruth had established. The financial resources that allowed the Yankees to acquire the best players came from the revenue streams Ruth had created. The winning tradition that attracted top talent originated in Ruth's championship teams. Baseball itself evolved in Ruth's image. Stadiums built after Yankee Stadium incorporated features designed to showcase home run hitters. Rule changes that increased offense and home run production reflected Ruth's influence on what fans wanted to see. The entire aesthetic of baseball, the emphasis on power, the celebration of individual achievement within a team context, and the tolerance for colourful personalities, all traced back to Ruth's example. Modern athletes earning enormous salaries, negotiating endorsement deals and living public lives that blur the line between sports and entertainment are following paths that Ruth pioneered. He proved that athletic excellence could generate wealth and fame that transcended the sport itself. Every athlete who becomes a brand, who leverages sporting success into broader cultural influence, owes something to the template Ruth created. As your eyelids grow heavier and the day's concerns fade into the comfortable darkness of evening, let's trace how Ruth's influence continues to ripple through American culture, even now, decades after his death. Walk into any youth baseball game on a Saturday morning and you'll see Ruth's legacy in action. Kids step to the plate and take mighty swings, trying to hit home runs rather than simply making contact. Parents in the stands cheer loudest for the ball that clears the fence, even though a well-placed single might be tactically superior. This emphasis on power over precision, on the dramatic over the practical, flows directly from Ruth's transformation of baseball's aesthetics. The number 3, retired by the Yankees and sacred in baseball history, appears on replica jerseys worn by fans who weren't born until decades after Ruth died. These fans may not know Ruth's actual statistics, might not be able to name a single team he played against, but they know the name and understand that wearing it connects them to something important in baseball's story. Baseball cards featuring Ruth's image remain among the most valuable collectibles in sports, with pristine examples selling for millions of dollars. The T206 Honus Wagner card is famous for its rarity, but Ruth cards are valuable because of who he was and what he represented. Collectors aren't just buying cardboard and ink, they're acquiring pieces of the moment when sports became central to American culture. The stories about Ruth, some true, some embellished, some entirely fabricated, form a mythology that serves baseball the way ancient myths served earlier civilizations. The called shot, the 60 home runs in 1927, the promise to hit a home run for a sick child and then delivering on that promise. These stories teach lessons about confidence, performance under pressure, and the rewards that come from daring greatly. Yankee Stadium, rebuilt in 2009 but incorporating design elements that deliberately echo the original, remains a shrine to Ruth even though he never played in the new version. Fans visiting the stadium for the first time make pilgrimages to Monument Park, where a plaque commemorates Ruth's achievements in language that borders on religious reverence. The stadium's dimensions still favour left-handed power hitters, a design choice that acknowledges Ruth's continuing influence on how the Yankees think about constructing their roster. The phrase Ruthian has entered the English language as an adjective meaning exceptionally large or powerful. When a slugger hits a particularly long home run, announcers describe it as Ruthian. When a player achieves something that seems to transcend normal boundaries, sports writers invoke Ruth's name. This linguistic immortality, the transformation of a person into an adjective, is reserved for the very few whose impact genuinely changes how we understand their field. Modern players who hit 40 or 50 home runs in a season are praised by comparison to Ruth, even though the game they're playing is dramatically different from the one Ruth dominated. Pitchers throw harder now, fielders are more athletic, stadiums are larger, and the scientific understanding of hitting mechanics has advanced enormously. Yet Ruth's shadow stretches across all these changes, his achievements serving as the standard against which power is measured. The curse of the Bambino, the superstitious belief that Boston's sale of Ruth to New York cursed the Red Sox franchise for 86 years, demonstrates Ruth's cultural penetration beyond pure sports. The fact that rational adults could believe that a player transaction in 1920 affected game outcomes in 2004 shows how deeply Ruth embedded himself in baseball's narrative structure. When the Red Sox finally won the World Series in 2004, breaking the alleged curse became as important to the story as the actual athletic achievement. Hollywood has repeatedly tried to capture Ruth on film with varying degrees of success. The challenge has always been that Ruth's life was almost too eventful, too packed with incident and achievement to fit into conventional narrative structures. How do you dramatise someone who actually lived larger than most fictional characters? The attempts continue, each generation trying to explain Ruth to audiences who live in increasingly different worlds from the one he inhabited. Children who will play baseball in 2050 will still learn Ruth's name and still hear stories about the Bambino who hit balls over buildings and ate hot dogs by the dozen. The details may blur and the context may fade, but the essential story, poor boy makes good through natural talent and irrepressible personality, remains as compelling as ever. Baseball historians continue to debate Ruth's place in the sports pantheon. Was he the greatest player ever, or does that honour belong to Willie Mays or Barry Bonds or Mike Trout? These debates miss the point. Ruth's importance isn't about being the best in some objective sense. It's about being the most transformative, the player who changed not just how baseball was played, but what baseball meant to American culture. Now, as you drift towards sleep, let's consider perhaps Ruth's most important legacy, one that statistics can't capture and that has nothing to do with championships or records. Ruth gave people joy, and he did it with an enthusiasm that was itself joyful to witness. Watch footage of Ruth hitting home runs, grainy, silent film that nevertheless conveys his obvious pleasure in the act. After connecting with a pitch, he doesn't admire his work or pose for cameras. He simply runs, a surprisingly graceful trot given his bulk, with a smile that suggests he's as delighted as the fans in the stands. Baseball was, for Ruth, genuinely fun, and his enjoyment was contagious. This might seem trivial, but think about what Ruth offered to Americans during his peak years. The 1920s brought prosperity for some, but anxiety for many, as traditional social structures gave way to modernity's uncertainties. The 1930s brought economic catastrophe, with unemployment, foreclosures, and the genuine fear that American democracy might not survive. Through all of this, Ruth played baseball with the unself-conscious joy of a child, reminding people that pleasure and delight remained possible even in difficult times. His home runs weren't just athletic achievements, they were permission slips for celebration. When Ruth connected with a pitch and the ball soared into impossibly distant seats, fans could forget their troubles for the seconds it took the ball to travel. They could rise from their seats, cheer without inhibition, and share a moment of uncomplicated happiness with thousands of strangers. Ruth never pretended to be a role model in the modern sense. He drank, he ate to excess, he caroused, and he made no particular effort to hide any of it. Yet somehow this honesty about his appetites made him more rather than less appealing. Americans understood that Ruth was flawed, but they also recognized that his flaws were human scale, the kind that anyone might have if they suddenly found themselves wealthy and famous. The relationship between Ruth and baseball fans was genuinely reciprocal. He loved their attention, fed off their energy, and performed better when stadiums were packed and roaring. Fans, in turn, loved him not just for what he did, but for how obviously he loved doing it. This mutual affection created a bond that transcended the usual relationship between athlete and spectator. Ruth's generosity with his time, particularly toward children, reflected his understanding that his fame created opportunities to bring happiness to others. When he visited a sick child in a hospital, signing a baseball and telling stories, he was giving that child something more valuable than memorabilia. He was giving them a story they could tell for the rest of their lives, a moment when they mattered to someone important. His teammates, even those who found his behaviour exasperating, generally loved him because Ruth treated baseball as play rather than work. In an era when most professional athletes approached their sport with grim seriousness, Ruth maintained the perspective that baseball was fundamentally a game. This attitude didn't make him less competitive. Ruth hated losing, but it kept him from the bitterness that consumed players who couldn't separate their self-worth from their performance. The joy Ruth embodied extended to his appreciation for his own success. He didn't pretend to be humble or act like his achievements were merely the product of hard work. Ruth understood that he had extraordinary talent, and he celebrated that talent openly. This self-awareness and lack of false modesty was in its own way refreshing. Ruth knew he was special, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. As sleep approaches and the story winds toward its close, consider what Ruth teaches us about living fully. His life wasn't long. 53 years is less than many of us will have, but it was completely lived. He experienced more pleasure, more success, more acclaim, and yes, more excess than most people could fit into twice that time. He never seemed to wonder if he deserved his success. He simply enjoyed it while it lasted. In your last moments of wakefulness, picture Yankee Stadium on a late summer afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the infield as another generation of players takes batting practice. The crack of the bat echoes off the stands, that distinctive sound that has remained unchanged for over a century. Somewhere in those stands sits a grandfather taking his grandson to his first baseball game. The boy's attention wanders. It's the 7th inning, and the game has been slow. Then the home team slugger steps to the plate, and the grandfather leans close to his grandson's ear. He tells him about another slugger, the first and maybe the greatest, a man who hit balls so far they seem to leave the atmosphere. The boy listens, not entirely sure if Grandpa is telling a story or recounting history. The slugger connects with a pitch, and the ball rises on a trajectory that every fan in the stadium recognizes instantly. It clears the fence by 50 feet, landing somewhere in the distant bleachers. The grandfather leaps to his feet. His knees hurt, but he doesn't care. And the grandson jumps up beside him, caught up in the moment even though he doesn't fully understand what he's witnessing. This is Ruth's final gift, the one that keeps giving decades after his death. The shared experience of baseball's most dramatic moment. The home run that makes strangers into a community, that transforms an afternoon into a memory, and that connects generations through the simple act of watching someone hit a ball with a stick. Every home run hit in every stadium in America carries an echo of the ones Ruth hit in stadiums that no longer exist, watched by fans who have long since passed away. The game evolves, rules change, and players get stronger and faster, but the fundamental thrill, the ball rising against the sky, arcing toward the fence, and landing in a distant section while fans roar, remains exactly what it was when Ruth did it for the first time. Ruth's story reminds us that sports matter not because they're important in some objective sense, but because they give us ways to connect with each other, with our past, and with the parts of ourselves that remember how to play. The boy from Baltimore who learned to pitch on reformatory fields never forgot that baseball was supposed to be fun, and he spent his entire career trying to share that fun with anyone who would watch. He succeeded beyond anything his younger self could have imagined. The orphan who felt unwanted became the most beloved figure in American sports. The undisciplined kid who couldn't follow rules became the man who rewrote them. The player who was sold by one team for money became the catalyst for a dynasty that redefined sports excellence. But perhaps most importantly, the child who grew up without much joy became the man who created it for millions. Every time someone's face lights up watching a home run, every time a kid imitates a power swing in a backyard, every time baseball brings people together in shared celebration, Babe Ruth is there, still playing the game he loved, still inviting everyone to join him in the simple pleasure of hitting a ball as far as possible and then running around some bases while people cheer. As you drift into sleep, you might dream of summer afternoons and the crack of a wooden bat, of balls rising against blue skies, of a round-faced man with a huge smile circling the bases while a stadium full of strangers becomes, for a moment, a community united in joy. These dreams connect you to millions of others who have found comfort and excitement in the same images, the same stories, and the same fundamental human desire to witness excellence and share in celebration. Babe Ruth lived more than 90 years ago, but his gift remains. The reminder that life is meant to be fully lived, that talent should be celebrated rather than hidden, and that joy shared multiplies while joy hoarded disappears. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere right now someone is hitting a home run, and for that moment they are Babe Ruth, and Babe Ruth lives again. The boy from Baltimore found his way home, and in doing so he helped millions of us find ours, on baseball diamonds, in stadium seats, in the stories we tell about the ones who came before, and in the simple shared pleasure of watching someone do something extraordinary. Picture London on a warm evening in late August 1939. The sun is setting over the Thames, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reflect off the river's surface like liquid copper. Street lamps are beginning their nightly ritual, that gentle flickering as they come to life one by one, creating pools of yellow warmth along the pavements. Shop windows glow with displays of summer dresses and wireless sets, casting rectangles of light onto the sidewalks where couples stroll arm in arm, their shadows long and lazy in the golden hour. You can hear the particular sounds of a city in its evening mode, the rumble of red double-decker buses, the clip-clop of delivery horses making their final rounds, and the cheerful ting of bicycle bells as workers pedal home for supper. From open windows comes the smell of cooking, roast dinners, boiled potatoes, and the yeasty warmth of fresh bread. Radios play dance music, the kind with horns and steady rhythms that make your foot tap without thinking about it. In Paris, the cafes are filling with their usual evening crowd. The Eiffel Tower stands illuminated against the darkening sky, its iron lattice outlined in electric brilliance like a piece of jewellery against velvet. There are neon signs advertising aperitifs, warm light coming from restaurant interiors, and the headlamps of Citroëns and Renaults making rivers of light along the Champs-Élysées. Street musicians play accordions on corners, their cases open for coins that clink with a satisfying metallic ring. Berlin too is bathed in light. The grand buildings along Unter den Linden are floodlit, their neoclassical facades standing proud and imposing. The shops stay open late, their windows full of goods that speak of prosperity and order. Electric trams hum along their tracks, their interiors bright and modern, filled with passengers reading newspapers or chatting about their days. These cities have spent decades building their electrical infrastructure, stringing miles of cable, installing countless fixtures, and creating networks of illumination that have become as fundamental to urban life as running water or paved streets. The age of electric light is barely 50 years old, still young enough to feel miraculous. People who grew up with oil lamps and candles now flip switches without thinking, banishing darkness with a casual gesture that would have seemed like sorcery to their grandparents. But on September 1st, 1939, everything changes. Germany invades Poland, and within hours, Britain and France are making preparations that have been planned in secret for months. Government officials retrieve documents from locked safes. Civil defence workers report to their posts. and ordinary citizens receive instructions that will alter the appearance of their world in ways both profound and peculiar. The blackout is coming. You might wonder why darkness would be chosen as a defense strategy. The logic is straightforward but chilling. Bombers navigating at night need visual reference points to find their targets. A city ablaze with light is as easy to spot from the air as a lighthouse on a dark coast. Remove that light, and the bombers are flying over an invisible landscape, unable to distinguish a munitions factory from a residential neighbourhood or a railway junction from a park. So the decision is made. When night falls, the lights must go out. Not just some lights, or most lights, but all lights. Every window must be covered, every street lamp extinguished, and every car driven with hooded headlamps that cast only the faintest glow. The great cities of Europe will disappear from view, pulled beneath a blanket of darkness as complete as any medieval village knew. The preparations happen with remarkable speed. Shops sell out of black fabric within hours. Hardware stores run out of paint, tape, cardboard, anything that might be used to block light. The government has printed millions of leaflets explaining the regulations, and these appear in letterboxes like strange invitations to a backwards party, where the goal is to extinguish rather than illuminate. You can imagine the conversations happening in homes across Britain that first weekend of September. Families standing in their parlours, looking at their windows with newfound assessment, calculating how many yards of material they'll need, whether thick curtains will suffice, or if they'll need something more substantial. There's an odd domesticity to these calculations, as if they're redecorating for some peculiar aesthetic preference rather than preparing for war. The instructions are specific and somewhat overwhelming. Windows must be covered so thoroughly that not a crack of light escapes. This includes skylights, glass doors, and even the tiny windows in bathrooms. The penalty for showing light is not insignificant. Fines that could strain a working family's budget, and more importantly, the social pressure of knowing that your carelessness might endanger your neighbours. On September 3rd, Britain officially declares war on Germany. That evening, as darkness approaches, the blackout begins in earnest. It's a Sunday, traditionally a day of rest, of family dinners and evening strolls. But this Sunday evening will be different from any the nation has known in living memory. The sun sets at approximately 7:30 p.m. on that first blackout evening in early September 1939. As twilight deepens, you would notice something extraordinary happening, or rather, not happening. The usual sequence of lights awakening across the city simply doesn't occur. The street lamps remain dark, shop windows stay unlit. The familiar glow that typically begins to define buildings and streets remains absent. Instead, there's a collective dimming, as if someone is slowly turning down the brightness control on the entire world. As the last and natural light fades from the western sky, darkness arrives with unusual completeness, not the partial darkness of a normal night, punctuated by human-made illumination, but something approaching the darkness of the countryside or wilderness, the kind of dark that city dwellers might encounter only on camping trips or during power outages. The psychological impact is immediate and disorienting. Human beings have an ancient, hardwired response to darkness. We are diurnal creatures, adapted for daylight activity, and our nervous systems treat darkness as a signal for rest or potential danger. For thousands of years, darkness meant retreat to shelter, gathering around fires, and ceasing productive activity until sunrise. Electric light changed all that, extending the day artificially, allowing cities to function around the clock. Now suddenly, that ancient relationship with darkness is restored, but in an urban context where it feels profoundly unnatural. You're surrounded by buildings and streets, the infrastructure of modern civilization, yet experiencing a darkness that belongs to a pre-industrial era. It creates a kind of temporal vertigo, as if you've travelled backward in time while remaining physically in the present. The first challenge is simply moving around. Walking down a familiar street becomes an exercise in careful navigation. Your eyes strain to distinguish shapes in the gloom, the outline of a pillar box, the curve of a curb, the silhouette of another person approaching. Curbs and steps become hazards. More than one person trips over their own doorstep in those early blackout evenings, misjudging distances in the absence of light. Cars and buses face even greater challenges. Vehicle headlamps must be fitted with special covers that restrict their light to a tiny slit, casting only the weakest beam onto the road ahead. Imagine driving at walking speed, peering through your windshield at a street you can barely see, watching for pedestrians who appear as mere shadows, and trying to avoid other vehicles that are equally difficult to spot. The accident rate in these early blackout days spikes alarmingly. Collisions between vehicles, cars striking pedestrians, and people walking into lampposts or falling into gutters. There's a particular comedy to some of these mishaps, though nobody finds them funny at the time. Respectable citizens stumble into hedges, delivery boys cycle into parked cars, a bishop walking home from evening service mistakes a stranger's front gate for his own, and spends several confused minutes trying to unlock it before realising his error. These little disasters become part of the blackout experience, stories to share over tea, and evidence that everyone is struggling with the same strange new reality. The government's air raid precautions wardens, quickly nicknamed ARP wardens, begin their patrols. These are ordinary citizens, volunteers and part-timers, given the authority to enforce blackout regulations. They walk the streets with masked torches, watching for any violation, any crack of light that might betray a city's presence to aircraft overhead. The wardens develop a certain reputation for zealousness. They'll knock sharply on doors at the faintest glimpse of light, their voices carrying through the darkness with urgent whispers, "Put that light out." The phrase becomes so common it turns into a kind of catchphrase, repeated in music halls and radio comedies, a verbal symbol of the blackout's intrusion into private life. Inside homes, families are adapting to their new evening routines. The process of preparing for blackout becomes a nightly ritual, performed as twilight approaches. You would rise from your chair, set down your tea, and begin the systematic covering of windows. Some families use elaborate curtain systems, heavy fabric on tracks that slide into place. Others make do with simpler solutions, blankets pinned over frames, sheets of cardboard wedged into place, and layers of newspaper taped to glass. The effect on interior space is claustrophobic. With windows covered, rooms lose their connection to the outside world. You can't glance out to check the weather, can't see the comforting glow of neighbouring houses, and can't watch the moon rise or stars appear. Your home becomes a sealed box, cut off from the usual visual reference points that orient you in time and space. Lighting inside must be carefully managed too. Many families reduce their use of electric lights, partly from habit, saving resources for the war effort, and partly from an almost superstitious fear that somehow light will escape despite their precautions. They rely instead on single dim bulbs or return to older technologies, oil lamps, candles and gaslight where it's still available. The quality of light changes, becoming warmer but weaker, creating deep shadows in room corners, making reading difficult and turning evening hours into something quieter and more subdued. There's an economic dimension to this darkness too. Electric companies reduce their output as demand plummets. Coal consumption drops as power stations throttle back. Street maintenance crews no longer need to service lamps. The entire infrastructure of urban illumination, built up over decades, sits idle. It's as if a major technological achievement has been suddenly paused, put on hold for the duration. But perhaps the most striking aspect of these first blackout nights is the quiet. With activities constrained by darkness, with people staying indoors more, and with traffic reduced to a cautious crawl, cities become genuinely hushed, in a way they haven't been since the 19th century. Standing on a London street at 9 o'clock on a blackout evening, you might hear sounds that normally drown in the urban cacophony. Wind rustling through plane trees, the distant hoot of an owl in a park, your own footsteps echoing off building facades, the creak of your shoe leather and the whisper of your coat, This quiet has its own peculiar quality, different from the silence of the countryside or wilderness. It's a metropolitan quiet, the sound of millions of people deliberately hushing themselves, suppressing their normal activities and existing in a state of communal restraint. It feels pregnant with potential, as if the city is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen or not happen. As September progresses into October, and October into November, the blackout stops being a shocking novelty and becomes instead the new normal. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, and people develop strategies, habits, and even preferences around their darkened existence. Shops adjust their hours, opening earlier to catch morning light and closing well before darkness makes shopping impractical. The rhythm of commercial life shifts backward, becoming more diurnal, more aligned with natural light cycles. Markets bustle at dawn in ways they haven't for generations. Office workers arrive earlier and leave earlier, trying to complete their commutes while the sun still offers some guidance. Fashion adapts to darkness with unexpected creativity. People begin wearing white or light-coloured clothing in the evenings, making themselves more visible to others navigating the gloom. Women carry their white handbags rather than darker ones. Men sport white handkerchiefs in their breast pockets. Some particularly safety-conscious individuals paint white stripes on their clothing, looking rather like zebras as they hurry along pavements. The practice extends to inanimate objects. Curbs are painted white to make them visible. The trunks of trees lining streets receive white bands. Pillar boxes get white stripes. Even dogs acquire white collars so they can be spotted in the darkness. The effect, glimpsed in whatever dim light is available, is oddly festive, as if the city has been decorated for some backward celebration, where white rather than bright colours provide the decoration. Businesses find innovative ways to continue operating despite the darkness. Restaurants use dim red lights that supposedly don't carry as far as white light. Cinemas schedule more matinee showings. Pubs install double-door systems. Small enclosed lobbies where patrons can enter and close one door before opening the second, preventing light from spilling onto the street. These little airlocks become social spaces in themselves, places where strangers pause together in compressed transition zones, sharing apologetic smiles in the darkness before one of them ventures to open the inner door. The entertainment industry adapts with characteristic resilience. Radio becomes even more central to evening life, providing entertainment that requires no light beyond what's needed to see the dial. Families gather around their wireless sets in dimly lit rooms, following dramas and comedies, listening to news broadcasts that have taken on new urgency. The BBC develops new programming specifically suited to blackout conditions. Gentle, calming content for people sitting in darkened rooms, trying not to think too much about why they're sitting in darkened rooms. Reading becomes more challenging. Even with curtains drawn and no light escaping, many people find it difficult to read by the dim bulbs they allow themselves. Books are held closer to faces, causing eye strain. Some people rediscover the pleasure of reading aloud, with partners or family members taking turns performing stories or newspaper articles for each other. It's a practice that had largely died out with widespread literacy and individual reading lights, now resurrected by necessity and turning out to be rather pleasant. A return to the old tradition of communal storytelling, updated for the 20th century. Children adapt to the blackout with the flexibility of youth, though it complicates their lives in numerous ways. School days reorganise around available daylight. Evening activities, scouts, girl guides and youth clubs either move to afternoon hours or take on a different character as participants gather in carefully blacked out halls. Games and activities shift toward those that don't require good visibility. Card games become popular. Board games experience a revival. Radio quiz shows inspire living room competitions. The blackout creates unexpected opportunities for mischief too. In the darkness, it's easier to stay out later than your parents realise, to slip away unseen, and to conduct the small rebellions of adolescence with reduced risk of detection. More than one teenager discovers that the blackout, for all its restrictions, offers a kind of freedom that comes with reduced surveillance. For young couples, the darkness provides both challenges and possibilities. Traditional courtship rituals, evening strolls, cinema visits, cafe dates, must be reconsidered. Walking together requires linking arms not just romantically but practically, for navigation and safety. The darkness creates a kind of intimacy by default, a closeness born of necessity that might not otherwise develop so quickly. First kisses happen in deeper darkness than any previous generation experienced, unobserved by passers-by who can barely see their own feet. Workers in essential services face particular challenges. Doctors making house calls navigate by memory and guesswork, their medical bags bumping against their legs as they feel their way along streets. Nurses on night shifts move through hospital corridors lit only by shielded lamps, checking on patients in wards kept darker than anyone finds comfortable. Fire brigades drill extensively for responding to emergencies in near total darkness, developing systems of communication that rely on sound and touch rather than visual signals. The postal service continues its rounds, though postmen learn to sort mail by feel as much as sight, their fingers developing sensitivity to different paper stocks and envelope sizes. Milk deliveries continue in the pre-dawn darkness, the clink of bottles and the rattle of crates providing a kind of alarm clock, announcing the coming day to those awake early enough to hear it. Public transportation becomes an exercise in faith and routine. Bus conductors develop an almost supernatural ability to recognise stops in the darkness, calling them out with confidence born of long familiarity. Passengers learn to count stops and to listen for landmarks, a particular church bell, the sound of the river, and the change in echo as the bus passes between buildings of different heights. Regular commuters develop mental maps so detailed they could navigate their routes blindfolded, which is essentially what they're doing. As the months progress and Britain settles into what becomes known as the Phony War, a period when war has been declared but major fighting hasn't yet reached British soil, the blackout reveals unexpected dimensions. What began as an emergency measure starts to disclose peculiar beauties and strange pleasures that coexist with the anxiety and inconvenience. The night sky becomes visible in ways that city dwellers haven't experienced in decades. Without the light pollution that normally obscures all but the brightest stars, the full glory of the cosmos appears overhead. On clear nights, stepping outside is like discovering a lost artwork that's been hanging in your home all along, hidden behind a curtain you didn't realise was there. You can see the Milky Way from central London, that cloudy band of distant stars stretching across the darkness like a river of light. Constellations appear not as isolated bright points, but as part of complex star fields, patterns within patterns, depths, and layers that electric light normally renders invisible. The moon, when it's up, seems preposterously bright, casting real shadows, turning streets into silvered mazes, and making you understand why poets and lovers have obsessed over it for millennia. Some people find this revelation of the night sky almost worth the inconvenience of the blackout. Astronomy clubs form, taking advantage of viewing conditions that rival rural observatories. Amateur stargazers set up telescopes in parks and gardens, sharing glimpses of Jupiter's moons, Saturn's rings, and the craters of the moon in unprecedented detail. There's something hopeful about this. People looking upward at beauty and vastness while preparing for conflict that feels petty and small by comparison. The darkness also reveals the bioluminescence that normally goes unnoticed. On damp nights, decaying wood in parks glows with foxfire, that eerie green phosphorescence produced by certain fungi. People discover it by accident, initially alarmed by the spectral light, then fascinated by this natural illumination that requires no electricity. Some gather pieces of glowing wood, bringing them home like captured fairy lights, watching them pulse and fade in darkened rooms. Sound takes on new prominence in the absence of visual stimuli. Your hearing becomes more acute, more attentive to the acoustic environment. You notice the different sounds that shoes make on different surfaces, the crisp click of leather on pavement, the softer scuff on dirt, and the hollow echo when crossing a bridge. You become aware of how sound reflects off buildings, how it carries differently in cold air versus warm, and how wind affects what you can and cannot hear. Music heard in the blackout takes on different qualities. A piano played in a darkened room, with only the faintest light to illuminate the keys, seems to fill the space more completely. The notes appear to have more presence, more weight. Street musicians, fewer now but still present, create pockets of melody in the darkness, and pedestrians pause to listen, in ways they might not in daylight, when vision provides so many competing distractions. Church bells continue to mark time, but their sound travels differently through the quieted city. Without traffic noise to muffle them, bells carry for miles, their various tones creating unintended harmonies as different churches mark the hours. Some people begin to navigate by bell sound, using familiar patterns to orient themselves even when visual landmarks are invisible. The blackout also amplifies smell. Without visual distraction, your nose provides more information than usual. You become aware of the particular scent of rain on stone, of fog carrying hints of the river, of coal smoke from chimneys, and of cooking from various houses, creating an olfactory map of your neighbourhood. Bakeries become locatable by scent before sight, the yeasty warmth of fresh bread serving as a beacon that draws customers through the darkness. But alongside these unexpected pleasures runs a constant undercurrent of unease. The darkness that reveals stars also conceals potential threats. Every shadow could be an obstacle, and every sound might signal danger. The human imagination, deprived of visual input, tends to fill in missing information with worst-case scenarios. That bump in the darkness is probably just someone's elbow making accidental contact, but for a moment your heart rate spikes with more primal fear. Women particularly feel vulnerable in the darkness. The reduced visibility that offers privacy to courting couples also provides cover for harassment and assault. Reported incidents of such crimes increase during the blackout, though it's unclear whether the actual rate rises or if darkness simply enables crimes that would happen regardless. Many women alter their routines, travelling only in groups, carrying whistles or other noisemakers, and avoiding certain areas that feel particularly threatening in the absence of light. The blackout also creates social isolation in unexpected ways. Without being able to see into neighbours' windows to note the comforting glow of occupied homes, people feel more alone. The physical proximity of urban life continues. You're still surrounded by thousands of other humans living their lives just beyond thin walls. But the visual confirmation of that presence disappears. Your neighbour might be 3 feet away on the other side of a wall, but in the darkness and quiet they might as well be miles distant. This isolation is particularly hard for the elderly and infirm. Those who already struggled with mobility find the darkness actively dangerous. The simple act of walking to a corner shop becomes fraught with hazard, unseen curbs to stumble over, obstacles to collide with, and the constant possibility of becoming disoriented and lost on familiar streets. Many older people choose to stay home more, venturing out only when absolutely necessary, accepting a constricted life as preferable to the risks of navigating the shadowed city. Mental health professionals notice an increase in reports of anxiety and depression. The darkness, combined with war stress, creates a psychological burden that some people struggle to manage. Sleep patterns disrupt. Some people sleep better in the deeper darkness, while others lie awake listening to every small sound, unable to relax into vulnerability. Dreams become more vivid for many, possibly because the darkness and quiet create fewer distractions from internal mental activity. Yet there's also a strange coziness to it all, a sense of communal experience that transcends the inconvenience and danger. Everyone is facing the same challenge, making the same adjustments, and developing the same odd competencies for navigating darkness. There's a camaraderie and shared difficulty, a democratic levelling that occurs when lord and labourer alike must feel their way along the same invisible street. Inside the blacked-out homes of Britain, family life reorganises itself around new limitations and possibilities. The blackout curtains that seal windows become daily fixtures, their operation as routine as making tea. Each evening, as natural light begins to fade, someone rises to perform the ritual, drawing heavy fabric across windows, checking for gaps, and ensuring no betraying gleam will mark the house from above. The rooms, once sealed, feel different, smaller somehow, even though their physical dimensions haven't changed. The absence of visual connection to the outside world makes interior spaces feel more like caves or cocoons, enclosed, inward-facing, and separate from the larger world. This can be comforting or claustrophobic depending on temperament and circumstance. For some, it creates a pleasant sense of snugness, everyone tucked safely together. For others, it feels confining, a nightly imprisonment in their own homes. Lighting becomes a subject of surprising complexity and importance. How much light is enough? Too little strains eyes and hampers activities, but too much feels wasteful, almost reckless. Families develop their own standards and practices. Some maintain just 1 or 2 lights in the most used rooms, leaving hallways and lesser used spaces in darkness. Others attempt to maintain something closer to their pre-war lighting levels, valuing normalcy over conservation. The quality of light matters too. Incandescent bulbs cast warm yellow-orange light that feels friendly and domestic. Gaslight, where it's still available, flickers slightly, creating moving shadows that some find nostalgic and others find eerie. Candles produce beautiful light but require attention. Someone must trim wicks, watch for drips, and ensure nothing catches fire. Oil lamps smell distinctive, a petroleum scent that becomes associated with winter evenings and the crackle of the wireless. Mealtimes adjust to the blackout's rhythms. Dinner happens earlier, while natural light still assists with cooking and table setting. The ritual of evening tea shifts backward too, or transforms into a simpler affair taken in dimly lit rooms. Some families find themselves eating more cold meals in the evening, avoiding the complexity of cooking in reduced light, and making do with sandwiches, leftover pie, cheese and crackers. Yet there's also an increased emphasis on making evening meals special, a conscious effort to maintain normalcy and comfort despite the circumstances. Mothers and wives take extra care with presentation, setting tables nicely even if the dining room is dim, using good china, and creating small ceremonies that assert civilization's continuity. These gestures matter more than they might seem. They're acts of resistance against the disruption, declarations that ordinary life persists despite extraordinary circumstances. After dinner, families gather together more than they might have before. With fewer options for individual entertainment, with darkness making it impractical to pursue separate activities in different rooms, people congregate in the best lit space, usually the sitting room or kitchen. This enforced togetherness recreates patterns of family life from earlier eras, before electric light allowed household members to scatter to different rooms pursuing individual interests. The wireless becomes the evening's focal point, its dial glowing like a small campfire, gathering the family around its broadcast voices. Programs structure the evening. The news at 9, followed by entertainment, then perhaps music before bed. Listening becomes a communal activity, something shared and discussed with reactions exchanged in real time. When something funny happens in a comedy program, the family's laughter mingles together in the dim room, creating a shared memory, a small moment of joy amidst anxiety. Games and puzzles experience a renaissance. Families bring out jigsaws, card decks, and board games that had been gathering dust in cupboards. These activities work well in dim light and accommodate multiple participants. The social dynamic shifts during gameplay. Hierarchies flatten, children can beat adults through luck or skill, and everyone participates on more equal terms. These evening game sessions create their own satisfaction, simple pleasures that don't require technology or brightness. Conversation, too, becomes more central to family life. Without the visual stimulation of bright rooms and varied activities, people talk more, tell stories, and share their days in greater detail. Parents discuss things with children that might normally be postponed or abbreviated. Siblings who might typically ignore each other in favour of separate pursuits find themselves actually conversing, getting to know each other better in these enforced periods of proximity. Reading aloud becomes a nightly ritual in many households. Father might read from the evening paper, sharing news and editorials, sometimes with commentary. Mother might read from novels, performing different voices for different characters, creating entertainment that doesn't require visual props. Older children might take turns reading, developing their expression and comfort with performance. These sessions revive an oral tradition that had been fading, turning literature back into something communal rather than solitary. Bedtime routines simplify in some ways. Without bright lights, the natural drowsiness that comes with darkness isn't artificially suppressed. Children get sleepy earlier, their circadian rhythms responding to environmental cues that electric light normally overrides. Parents find it easier to get little ones to bed when the whole house is already dim and quiet, when there's not much exciting happening to miss. But the darkness also introduces new nighttime fears, especially for children. The shadows in a dimly lit bedroom seem deeper, more ominous. The usual reassurance of "there's nothing there" becomes harder to verify when you actually can't see into corners and closets. Some parents leave candles burning, accepting the fire risk as preferable to childhood terror. Others develop new bedtime rituals, longer tucking-in sessions, stories told in soothing tones and songs hummed until sleep arrives. For parents themselves, the blackout creates its own intimacy and distance. Once children are asleep, couples have the evening to themselves in ways they might not have before, when evening activities might scatter family members to various entertainments. Yet the darkness and quiet also emphasize their isolation. Two people in a sealed house on a darkened street, living through history without knowing how the story ends. Some couples use this time for serious conversations that daylight and distraction had allowed them to postpone. Discussions about money, about plans for possible evacuation, about fears and hopes, and about what they'll do if the war intensifies. Other couples deliberately avoid heavy topics, preferring to maintain lightness to protect their evening hours as refugees from worry. They play cards, listen to music, and simply sit together in comfortable silence, taking comfort from physical proximity. The blackout affects married life in unexpected ways. The darkness provides privacy even in homes with thin walls and multiple inhabitants. Intimacy becomes easier when visual privacy is assured, when darkness guarantees discretion. Some couples find their relationship strengthened by the enforced closeness and the shared experience of adapting to strange circumstances. Others find the proximity without escape grating, the inability to retreat into separate activities, creating friction that might otherwise dissipate. Elderly family members, often living with their adult children, face particular challenges. Many older people have always relied heavily on visual cues, and the reduction in light makes everything harder. Reading, knitting, even just moving around the house safely. Families must decide how to balance their elders' needs for light with blackout requirements and conservation concerns. Compromises emerge. Brighter lights in grandmother's room, even if the rest of the house remains dim. Extra candles placed strategically. More assistance with evening tasks that darkness makes difficult. The blackout also reveals class differences in domestic experience. Wealthier families can afford heavier curtains, better blackout materials, and perhaps even specially designed blackout systems with multiple layers. Their homes might have more rooms, allowing family members more privacy despite the enforced evening togetherness. They might maintain closer to normal lighting levels, considering the extra electricity expense and acceptable cost for comfort. Working-class families make do with cheaper solutions, blankets nailed over windows, newspaper pasted to glass, and curtains sewn from whatever fabric could be afforded. Their smaller homes mean less privacy, more enforced proximity, and everyone living in each other's pockets even more than usual. Economies in lighting hit harder when you're already budgeting carefully for every shilling. Yet there's a democratizing element too. Rich and poor alike must darken their homes. The Duke in his mansion and the docker in his terrace row both spend their evenings in dimmed rooms. Both must navigate the same darkened streets. The blackout is one of the few wartime measures that truly applies equally across social strata, creating a rare moment of shared experience across class lines. As 1939 turns into 1940, and the blackout continues month after month, something remarkable happens. People stop thinking about it quite so much. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through sheer repetition. The nightly ritual of darkening windows transforms from a conscious process into a habit, performed with the automaticity of brushing teeth or locking doors. Innovations accumulate, small improvements that collectively make the darkness more manageable. Enterprising individuals develop gadgets and solutions that spread through communities like helpful folklore. Someone discovers that painting stair edges with luminous paint makes them safer to navigate. The idea spreads, and soon glowing stair edges become common, little safety features that cost pennies but prevent countless falls. Shops begin selling specially designed blackout accessories, torches with narrow beams and red filters that supposedly don't compromise night vision, reflective armbands and badges for pedestrians, luminous buttons that can be sewn onto coats, white-painted walking sticks. The commercial world adapts to serve the darkened consumer, finding profit even in darkness. Fashion truly embraces the blackout aesthetic. Designers create clothing with safety features built in, white piping on dark coats, reflective threads woven into fabrics, and light-coloured accessories that serve the dual purposes of style and visibility. Women's magazines run features on blackout beauty, suggesting makeup and hairstyles suited to dim lighting. The advice is practical and sometimes absurd. Lighter face powder is recommended because it's more visible, while dark lipstick is warned against lest you become a pair of disembodied lips floating in the darkness. Restaurants and pubs develop elaborate workarounds for the blackout restrictions. Some establishments paint their windows opaque black, but install elaborate interior lighting, creating spaces that feel almost normal once you're inside. Others embrace the dimness, installing red or blue lights that create atmospheric spaces while technically complying with regulations. Nightclubs in particular find that dim lighting can be romantic or mysterious, transforming a restriction into a feature. The entertainment industry becomes increasingly creative. Cinemas develop complex procedures for seating people in darkness, ushers with covered torches, luminous floor markers, and spaced entry times to prevent traffic jams in the lightless aisles. Some theatres experiment with matinee-only schedules, accepting reduced evening business rather than dealing with blackout complications. Others thrive precisely because they offer bright escapism inside while maintaining complete darkness outside. Radio programs evolve to suit their audience's circumstances. Content becomes more domestic, more suited to family listening in dimmed rooms. Comedy programs emphasize verbal humor over visual gags. Dramas rely on sound effects and voice acting to create vivid mental images. The BBC becomes increasingly sophisticated in its understanding of how to create entertainment for a population sitting in the dark, unable to do much else besides listen. Local communities develop collective coping strategies. Neighbourhoods organise blackout socials, gatherings where people can meet and commingle despite the darkness. Churches host evening services that become social events as much as religious ones, providing both spiritual comfort and human connection. Community centres run activities specifically designed for low-light conditions, music sessions, discussion groups, and collective listening to important broadcasts. Street communities become more tight-knit through the shared experience. Neighbours who might previously have exchanged only perfunctory greetings now check on each other, help each other with blackout preparations, and share resources and solutions. The darkness creates a kind of frontier mentality, a sense that you're all in this together, facing common challenges that require mutual support. Children, remarkably resilient, turn the blackout into play. They invent games suited to darkness. elaborate versions of hide and seek, treasure hunts that rely on touch and sound rather than sight, and theatrical performances put on in dimmed rooms where imagination fills in for visual spectacle. The blackout becomes normalised in their experience, not a temporary disruption, but simply how the world works, as natural as rain or school or Sunday roast. Teachers adapt their lesson plans, incorporating blackout realities into education. Science classes discuss astronomy with newfound relevance. Students can actually see what they're learning about. History lessons draw parallels to medieval life, helping children understand that most of human history occurred without electric light. Art classes experiment with low-light media, charcoal drawings, shadow puppets, and projects that work despite limited visibility. Physical coordination improves across the population as people develop better spatial awareness. Your proprioception, that internal sense of where your body is in space, sharpens when visual input becomes unreliable. People learn to move more carefully, more consciously, developing a kind of bodily intelligence that modern life had allowed to atrophy. The simple act of walking becomes more mindful, more present, and less the unconscious automatic process it had been. Health effects emerge, both positive and negative. Accident rates from the darkness remain elevated. People continue to trip, collide, and stumble into objects. But there are unexpected benefits too. The earlier evening schedules mean people get more sleep, and their circadian rhythms are more aligned with natural light-dark cycles. The reduction in artificial light at night might be improving sleep quality, though nobody's conducting formal studies to verify this. The enforced indoor evenings mean less exposure to cold and damp for some, potentially reducing winter illness. Seasonal variations in the blackout create different challenges and experiences. Summer evenings, with their late sunsets, require shorter periods of blackout, perhaps just 3 or 4 hours. People can enjoy long twilights and extended time outdoors while it's still light enough to see. Picnics and garden parties adapt to earlier schedules, wrapping up before darkness makes them impractical. But winter brings longer blackout periods, sometimes 16 hours or more of required darkness. The psychological weight of this is considerable. Waking in darkness, working through short daylight hours, returning home to more darkness. It feels oppressive, endless. Seasonal affective disorder, though not yet named or officially recognised, surely affects many. The lack of light combines with war anxiety to create periods of genuine depression for some. December 1939 brings the blackout's first winter holiday season. Christmas presents unique challenges. How do you maintain festive cheer in compulsory darkness? Families rise to the challenge with determination that borders on defiance. Christmas lights, those strings of coloured bulbs that normally decorate windows and trees, must be abandoned or drastically modified. Some people create elaborate interior displays, decorating trees in rooms with completely blacked out windows, creating private festivals of light that can't be seen from outside. Carol singing adapts to blackout conditions. Groups carry covered lanterns as they move from house to house, their voices rising in the darkness, creating moments of beauty and connection that feel more precious for the surrounding gloom. The ancient hymns about light coming into darkness take on new resonance. Silent Night feels especially appropriate when nights are so profoundly silent and dark. Gift-giving focuses on practical items suited to blackout life. Torches, luminous paint, warm clothing, and books for reading aloud. But there are frivolous gifts too. Deliberate assertions of normalcy and joy despite circumstances. Dolls and toy soldiers for children, perfume and stockings for wives, and pipes and tobacco for husbands. These gestures matter enormously. Small defiances against the war's restrictions, declarations that life and pleasure continue. New Year's Eve presents its own strange circumstances. The traditional celebrations, gathering in public squares, watching for midnight, and the explosion of noise and light as the new year arrives, must be reimagined. People celebrate in darkened homes, listening for church bells, gathering around wireless sets for special broadcasts. When midnight comes, they might step outside into darkness, hearing distant voices calling greetings they cannot see, feeling connected to invisible neighbours through sound alone. The turn to 1940 brings renewed determination. The blackout will continue, but people have learned to live with it. The initial shock has worn off, replaced by practiced competence. You know how to navigate your street in darkness. You know how long your blackout preparations take. You know which activities work in dim light and which don't. The learning curve has been climbed, and what remains is simply persistence. The blackout continues through 1940 and beyond, lasting in various forms until September 1944, when regulations finally relax as the threat of bombing diminishes. But even before official relaxation, the blackout evolves and becomes less absolute. As military technology improves and bombing strategies change, the strict requirements loosen slightly. Dim lights become permissible in some circumstances. The complete darkness of those first months gradually lightens to a more manageable gloom. The first relaxations are tentative, almost apologetic. Regulations allow heavily shielded street lighting in some areas, not the full illumination of pre-war years, but enough to prevent the worst accidents and to make navigation possible without constant hazard. These new lights cast pools of dim radiance that seem extraordinarily bright after years of complete darkness, even though they are actually quite faint by historical standards. People's reactions to these first returns of public lighting reveal how much the darkness has affected them. Some feel immediate relief, an easing of tension they hadn't quite realised they were carrying. The simple ability to see where you're walking, to recognise faces, to orient yourself visually, these feel like luxuries, gifts restored after long deprivation. Others feel oddly uncomfortable with the light's return. After years of darkness, even dim lighting can feel exposing and vulnerable. Some people have grown accustomed to the anonymity that darkness provides, the sense of being unseen as you move through public spaces. The return of light, however faint, removes that protective invisibility. The gradual restoration progresses through 1944 as Allied forces push across Europe and the threat to Britain recedes. More lights return, regulations relax further, and the familiar glow of evening civilization begins to rebuild. Shop windows light up first, just modestly, but enough to display goods and to create welcoming spaces. Then street lamps return to more normal operation, their familiar yellow-orange light painting pavements and facades. For those who remember the change, and by this point young children have lived their entire conscious lives under blackout conditions, the restoration of light feels almost magical. Streets that had been navigated by memory and faith suddenly reveal themselves in detail. Buildings show their full architectural character. Faces become readable from a distance. The urban landscape recovers its visible complexity. The psychological impact of restored lighting is profound and multifaceted. There's certainly celebration, relief, and joy at this tangible symbol of the war's waning. But there's also a strange sadness, an unexpected nostalgia for something that everyone complained about constantly while it was happening. The blackout years, for all their difficulty, had created a kind of fellowship, a shared experience that had bound communities together. With the return of light comes the return of normal urban anonymity, the dissolution of that intense mutual dependence. Some of the innovations and adaptations developed during the blackout persist, even after they're no longer necessary. People who learn to navigate by sound and memory retain those skills. Families who discovered they enjoyed evening read-aloud sessions continue them even when bright lights would permit individual reading. Communities that drew together in darkness maintain some of that closeness, those relationships that formed during shared difficulty. The physical traces of the blackout persist too. White-painted curbs and tree trunks remain, their purpose obsolete but their presence continuing. Blackout curtains stay up in many homes. Why take them down when they're already installed, when they're useful for privacy, when they're a reminder of survival? architectural features designed for the Blackout era. Those double-door entries on pubs, the carefully positioned lighting fixtures, remain as fossils of a particular historical moment. The ecological effects of the Blackout years gradually reverse. As artificial light returns, the night sky slowly disappears again behind its veil of urban glow. The stars fade from easy visibility. The Milky Way withdraws. The darkness that had revealed celestial beauty is pushed back by human illumination. Some people mourn this loss, realizing that the Blackout had given them a gift they'll never receive again, the regular sight of the universe above their heads. The generation that lived through the Blackout carries memories that shape their relationship with light and darkness for the rest of their lives. Those who were children during the Blackout often develop either a strong preference for darkness, finding comfort in the nighttime environment they knew as children, or an equally strong preference for abundant light, a kind of overcompensation for years of enforced dimness. The Blackout leaves its mark on British culture in subtle ways. A certain comfort with dimmer lighting persists. British homes and public spaces tend toward more modest illumination than their American counterparts, a preference that may trace partially to this period of enforced darkness. The idea that too much light is wasteful, even slightly vulgar, becomes embedded in aesthetic sensibility. The historical memory of the Blackout carries multiple meanings. It becomes a symbol of British resilience, of the Home Front's contribution to the war effort, and of collective sacrifice for a common cause. Politicians and cultural commentators invoke the Blackout as an example of what a society can endure when properly motivated, when united by shared purpose. But the Blackout also serves as a reminder of war's intrusion into civilian life, of how conflict transforms ordinary existence in ways both large and small. It demonstrates that warfare is not just distant battles fought by soldiers, but also the accumulated small deprivations and adjustments that everyone must make. The nightly ritual of darkening windows, the cautious navigation of familiar streets, and the adaptation of every evening routine to accommodate the absence of light. For modern observers, the Blackout offers a peculiar window into a world that's simultaneously recognisable and alien. The Britain of 1939 had electricity, radio, automobiles, and cinema, all the technological fixtures of modern life. Yet the deliberate removal of just one element, artificial light after dark, transformed daily experience in ways that connected people backward to pre-industrial patterns of living. There's something almost meditative about contemplating the Blackout years, this period when millions of people deliberately darken their world, sitting in dimmed rooms, navigating shadowed streets, and learning to experience their environment through senses other than sight. In our current era of constant illumination, when light pollution is so pervasive that many children grow up never seeing the Milky Way, when cities glow so brightly that they're visible from space, there's something oddly appealing about this historical moment of chosen darkness. The Blackout reminds us that our relationship with light and darkness is not fixed or natural, but historically constructed, shaped by technology, regulation, and social practice. For most of human history, darkness was inevitable. You made the best light you could with fire or oil, but ultimately night meant darkness. Electric light changed this, pushing darkness back and extending the day artificially. The Blackout briefly reversed this transformation, restoring darkness not through technological failure, but through deliberate choice. As you lie here now, warm and comfortable, in a room where light is available at the flick of a switch, it's worth contemplating what the Blackout reveals about human adaptability and resilience. The people of Britain in 1939 didn't know how long the war would last, whether the Blackout would be needed for weeks or years, or whether their cities would survive or be destroyed. Yet they adapted, persevered, and found moments of beauty and connection amidst the enforced darkness. The Blackout demonstrates something essential about human communities, that we can endure significant disruption to normal life when we understand the purpose behind it, when we believe we're contributing to something larger than our individual comfort. The nightly ritual of darkening windows became a form of participation, a tangible action that connected each household to the national effort. There's something deeply human about gathering in darkened rooms, about families coming together around dim lights, about community supporting each other through shared difficulty. These patterns recur throughout human history, around ancient campfires, in medieval great halls lit by rushlight, and in pioneer cabins on winter evenings. The blackout temporarily restored these older patterns, using modern technology to recreate pre-modern conditions. The sensory richness of the blackout experience, the visible stars, the amplified sounds, the heightened awareness of smell and touch, suggests that our normal brightly lit existence may diminish certain forms of awareness and experience. We gain practical benefits from abundant light, certainly, but we may lose other kinds of perception, other ways of experiencing our environment and each other. The blackouts enforce slowdown, its requirement for more careful movement, more deliberate action, and more time spent in quiet domestic settings. These create a quality of life that many people found surprisingly satisfying despite the circumstances. The frantic pace of modern life, the constant visual stimulation, the ability to pursue individual activities in separate rooms with independent lighting. All these innovations have costs as well as benefits. Consider how the blackout changed social interaction. In darkness, you couldn't judge people by their appearance quite so readily. Conversations happened without the constant visual feedback we normally rely on. People learned to listen more carefully, to pay attention to voice tone and word choice rather than facial expressions and body language. This created different kinds of intimacy and different patterns of connection. The democratizing effect of the blackout, the way it affected rich and poor alike, created a rare moment of genuinely shared experience across social classes. The Duke and the Doctor both navigated the same darkened streets, both sat in dimmed rooms, and both faced the same challenges of maintaining normal life despite abnormal conditions. This shared experience contributed to the social solidarity that characterized Britain during the war years. The blackout also reveals something about the relationship between freedom and security. The regulations represented a significant restriction of personal liberty. You couldn't light your own home as you wished, couldn't move freely at night without risk, and face penalties for violations. Yet most people accepted these restrictions as legitimate and necessary, a reasonable trade-off for collective safety. The balance between individual freedom and common security is never simple, never permanent. It must be constantly negotiated and renegotiated. The innovations and adaptations that emerged during the blackout, the luminous paint, the white-marked curbs, the hooded headlamps, the double-door entries, represent human creativity responding to constraint. Necessity truly does mother invention, and the blackout years produced countless small solutions to the problems that darkness created. These innovations demonstrate that restrictions can inspire, rather than merely limit, that working within constraints can generate creativity. The return of light after years of darkness must have felt like emerging from a long tunnel. The familiar world revealed again the simple pleasure of seeing clearly, of moving without constant caution, of windows that connect rather than seal. Yet along with this relief came the loss of something too, that peculiar intimacy that darkness had created, that sharpened awareness, that sense of shared endurance. For those who lived through it, the blackout becomes one of those formative experiences that shape perception for a lifetime. They carry memories of navigating darkness, of families gathered in dim rooms, of stars brilliant overhead, and of the particular quality of silence that descended on cities designed for noise. These memories become stories, then history, then legend, part of the narrative that nations tell themselves about their past. As we come to the end of our journey through the blackout years, as your eyelids grow heavier and your breathing slows, let's gather the gentle lessons that this history offers for your own rest tonight. The blackout teaches us that darkness is not necessarily something to fear, but rather a natural state that humans lived with for millennia before electric light became common. Those wartime Britons learned to find comfort and even beauty in darkness. The visible stars, the heightened awareness of sound and smell, and the coziness of dimly lit rooms where families gathered close. As you prepare for sleep, you're participating in the same ancient human practice, voluntarily entering darkness, trusting it to hold you safely while your consciousness dims. The darkness of sleep is restorative, necessary, and a gift rather than a threat. Like those blackout nights, it offers a time of rest, of withdrawal from the constant stimulation of waking life, and of renewal that comes through quiet and absence of light. The blackout families who learn to slow down, to move more carefully, to pay attention to senses beyond sight, they discovered rhythms that sleep requires too. The winding down, the gradual dimming, the shift from activity to stillness. These transitions matter. They prepare body and mind for the darkness of sleep, just as blackout preparations readied homes for the darkness of night. The resilience of those blackout years reminds us that humans can adapt to almost anything and can find peace and even pleasure in circumstances that initially seem impossible. If they could learn to thrive in darkened cities, you can certainly trust yourself to the darkness of your bedroom, to the natural process of sleep that your body knows how to perform. The community and connection that emerged from the shared blackout experience suggests something about the importance of letting go, of accepting limitations, and of working with rather than against circumstances. Sleep requires this same surrender. You cannot force it, only create conditions that welcome it. Like those families dimming their lights and settling into evening quiet, you prepare the space and then allow the darkness to do its work. Those visible stars during the blackout, the celestial beauty that emerged when artificial light withdrew, remind us that darkness reveals as well as conceals. In sleep's darkness, dreams emerge, unconscious processes do their necessary work, and the mind sorts and files and heals in ways that can't happen in waking light. Trust the darkness to show you what you need to see. The gradual adaptation to the blackout, the way fear transformed into competence and then comfort, mirrors the journey into sleep that you make each night. At first, letting go of consciousness can feel vulnerable, even frightening. But with practice, with trust, it becomes natural, even welcome. The darkness becomes familiar, safe, and a friend rather than a threat. As the blackout eventually lifted and light returned, so too will you wake tomorrow to light and activity. But for now, like those wartime families settling into their dimmed homes, you can embrace this time of darkness and quiet. Let your eyes close like blackout curtains drawing shut. Feel your awareness dim like lights turning down. Allow yourself to sink into stillness like a city going quiet under the night sky. The people of the blackout years survived not through constant vigilance, but through acceptance, adaptation, and the ability to find peace in altered circumstances. They learned that darkness could be endured, that it brought gifts along with its challenges, and that life continued and even flourished under its cover. Your sleep tonight is your personal blackout, a time of chosen darkness, of withdrawal from the world's demands, of rest and restoration. Like those wartime Britons, you don't know exactly what tomorrow will bring, but you can trust that this period of darkness will prepare you for whatever light reveals. The last lesson of the blackout is perhaps the most important, that sometimes the most valuable thing we can do is simply stop, darken our world, and rest. Not as defeat or retreat, but as necessary preparation for continuing. Those nightly blackout rituals weren't just safety measures, they were acknowledgements that activity must balance with stillness, that light needs darkness as a counterpoint, and that life requires periods of quiet and rest. So let yourself rest now. Let the darkness hold you as it held those millions of people through their blackout years, safely, gently, preparing you for whatever tomorrow's light will bring. Your eyes are growing heavy. Your breath is slowing. The darkness around you is peaceful, protective, and appropriate. Sleep well, knowing that you're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most natural practices. The darkness is your friend tonight, just as it became the friend of those who learned to live through the Great Blackout. Rest easy, rest deep, rest well. And when morning comes, when light returns, you'll wake refreshed as those blackout families woke to another day. Resilient, adapted, and ready to continue. For now though, just darkness, just quiet, just rest. Sleep well. Let me tell you about a boy who would grow up to touch the ceiling of the most famous chapel in the world. Imagine yourself relaxing in a cosy chair on a calm evening. He was born on March 6th, 1475, in the small hillside town of Caprese, where the morning mist clung to old stone houses like slumbering cats. His name was Michelangelo Buonarroti, but his friends just called him Michel. Do you know how certain things appeal to certain kids? While some people chase butterflies and others adore books, young Michel had a peculiar obsession. He was gathering pebbles and examining their shapes, turning them over in his tiny hands as if they were secrets, while other 6-year-olds were playing with wooden toys. His father, Lodovico, was a local magistrate. Think of him as the town's official paper pusher, and he had grand plans for his son that definitely didn't involve getting dusty with the rocks. When Michel was little, the family relocated to Florence, which would later serve as both his inspiration and playground. In the 1480s, Florence was more than just a city. It was like living inside a jewellery box with ideas and art glistening on every surface. The Medici family ruled there as wealthy patrons who collected artists in the same way that some people collect rare coins. But they were not kings. When Michel was just 6 years old, his mother Francesca passed away. Children are shaped by loss. Sometimes it pushes them towards something bigger, and other times it makes them retreat inward. It appeared to do both for Michel. He grew quieter and more perceptive, spending hours observing stonemasons fix structures because he was captivated by their ability to bend hard marble. In an attempt to guide him toward a respectable career in banking or government, his father enrolled him in grammar school. Michel, however, had different plans. He would doodle in the margins of his books instead of focusing on Latin conjugations, creating intricate drawings of hands, faces, and the way light fell across a windowsill. Michel couldn't help himself, but his teachers weren't amused. For him, creating art was more than just a hobby. It was a way of life. At the age of 13, Michel joined Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of Florence's most prosperous painters, as an apprentice, defying his father's wishes and likely amid some heated family disputes. You can appreciate Lodovico's horror if you can picture your adolescent today declaring they're dropping out to pursue a career as a street artist. However, as is often the case with future geniuses, Michel was obstinate. The Ghirlandaio workshop resembled an art factory from the Renaissance. Apprentices prepared canvases, ground pigments, and picked up skills by imitating the master's methods. For Michel, painting was a bit confining, but most boys were excited to eventually paint a small portion of a larger piece. Because of the three-dimensional challenge of bringing life from inanimate stone, he continued to gravitate towards sculpture. His story takes an intriguing turn at this point. In his gardens, Lorenzo de' Medici, also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, had established a sort of art academy. Young artists could study classical sculpture and receive instruction from the best at this experimental school. Michel was invited to join after Lorenzo's scouts saw his work. The boy who had been gathering pebbles was now touching marble that had been carved before the birth of Christ and strolling through gardens brimming with statues from ancient Rome. It was like winning the Renaissance lottery to live in the Medici household. Ideas crackled in the air like logs on a fire, poets recited new verses, and philosophers debated at the tables where you ate. Even though Michel was only 15 and still developing his lanky frame, he was taking in everything: the art, the conversations, and the realization that people could make beautiful things that would last. He once carved a sleeping Cupid that was so realistic and expertly done that someone proposed artificially aging it and marketing it as an antique Roman item. The strategy was successful, until the buyer realized the fraud. The collector, however, was impressed rather than incensed. Who was this young person capable of deceiving professionals? At that moment, Michel became aware of a significant aspect of himself. He was not merely talented, but exceptionally so. This type of talent only occurs perhaps once every generation. Like learning you can fly but not being sure you want to take off, it was both exhilarating and terrifying. As you go to sleep tonight, visualize that young man standing among marble statues in those Medici gardens, his hands already smeared with stone dust, his mind racing with ideas he had not yet been able to grasp. When Michel was 21 years old and packing his few possessions for Rome in 1496, he felt as though the world was waiting for him. His school had been Florence, but Rome was the birthplace of legends and the making of reputations. Imagine him travelling toward the city that had ruled the world on that dusty road, most likely on a borrowed horse, with his sketchbook securely tucked away in his saddlebag. In the late 1400s, Rome resembled a huge archaeological site where people continued to live and work. There were pieces of the ancient empire everywhere you looked. Walls constructed from stones that had seen Caesar's victories, marble statues without arms but still exuding strength, and broken columns supporting tavern roofs. It was like entering paradise for an artist who was enamoured with classical beauty. A French cardinal who wanted something unique for his tomb gave Michel his first significant commission. The young sculptor proposed a Pietà, Mary holding the dead Christ, and spent months sketching, studying anatomy, and preparing for what would become his masterpiece. The problem with marble, however, is that it is not forgiving of errors. A bad cut cannot be repaired or erased. Each chisel stroke is a tiny act of faith. He spent whole days in the workshop working on the Pietà like a man possessed, coming out with marble dust under his fingernails and in his hair. The tenderness of the sculpture he made was revolutionary. Michel carved Mary and Christ as though they were actual people, caught in a moment of great sorrow and grace, in contrast to the conventional medieval style that made figures appear rigid and symbolic. However, something annoying occurred when the piece was revealed. After admiring it, visitors would inquire, "Who carved this?" and shake their heads incredulously when informed that it was a young man from Florence. One night, Michel did something he would never do again in his career. He sneaked back and carved his name directly on Mary's sash, saying, "Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, made this." Like a Renaissance graffiti artist claiming credit, it's funny to imagine this future universe master sneaking around St. Peter's Basilica in the dark with his chisel. However, it was successful. Everyone in Rome was suddenly aware of Michelangelo's identity after the Pietà established his reputation. He also produced his well-known sculpture of the Roman wine god, Bacchus, around this period. Now, the majority of artists depicted Bacchus as a godlike and dignified figure, but Michel had a different vision. His Bacchus has the soft body of someone who has had too much good living, and he appears to be a little inebriated, swaying a little. It was witty and clever, demonstrating that Michel was aware of human nature, even when he was portraying gods. The achievement presented new difficulties. Rich customers started vying for his attention by paying progressively higher prices for his sculptures. Michel, however, was picky about his commissions. He desired projects that would challenge his abilities and allow him to test the limits of what marble could accomplish, not just financial gain. Representatives from Florence showed up one day with an interesting proposal. A huge block of marble that had been there for decades was in the city. After a few attempts, earlier sculptors had abandoned it, claiming it was defective and useless. The Florentines pondered whether Michel would want to look. The block would have to be moved back to Florence because it was so big, 17 feet high. Like a physician examining a patient, Michel studied the marble. He walked around it, felt its surface with his hands, and examined the cuts and grain. He saw potential where other sculptors saw problems. He could already picture the figure imprisoned inside, awaiting release, in his imagination. This commission would become David. It wasn't just any commission. Months passed during the negotiations. Michel desired a suitable workspace, sufficient compensation, and total creative control. The city officials agreed to everything, possibly believing that someone would solve their marble problem. They were unaware that they were commissioning the world's most well-known sculpture. Michel took a final stroll through the historic streets of Rome as he got ready to head back to Florence. He was departing as a master, having arrived as a budding young artist. He had learned from the Eternal City that beauty could endure centuries of conflict and turmoil, that art could transcend empires, and that a talented hand could transform stone into a language that would endure forever. As you drift off to sleep tonight, picture Michel, already seeing David's face in his dreams, loading that massive block of marble onto a cart. Those times when everything in your life falls into place, when all of your knowledge and abilities come together to work on the ideal project at the ideal moment, have a certain allure. That moment for Michel, who is now 26 and back in Florence, was when he first saw the enormous block of marble that would eventually become David. The marble had a fascinating backstory. Decades before, it had been taken from Carrara and used to make a sculpture of David for Florence Cathedral. 2 previous sculptors had attempted it. Agostino di Duccio had started carving but abandoned it, and Antonio Rossellino had been commissioned to continue but also gave up. By 1501, the block, which the locals called the Giant, had devolved into a public disgrace, akin to a costly piece of exercise equipment collecting dust in a corner. In order to safeguard his work and his privacy, Michel constructed a wooden shelter around the marble in the cathedral courtyard, where he set up his workshop. This was his world for the next 3 years. He would get there before the sun came up and work until it went out, frequently skipping meals. City officials defended their investment despite complaints from the neighbours about the continuous tapping of a chisel on stone. They had a sneaking suspicion that something extraordinary was taking place behind those wooden walls. Reimagining a well-known tale was more important to David's creation than technical proficiency. Earlier artists had depicted David standing over Goliath's severed head following his victory. Michel, however, saw things differently. His David is shown just before the fight, his muscles tensed, his gaze fixed on the approaching giant, a young man mustering the will to fight an impossible battle. David represented everyone who had ever had to overcome insurmountable odds, which in plague-stricken, war-torn Renaissance Italy meant almost everyone. The physical difficulties were tremendous. The marble weighed more than 6 tons and stood 17 feet tall. Michel had to climb ladders and scaffolding, constantly changing his perspective in order to check his proportions. He devised a method for creating tiny wax models and then enlarging them, applying mathematical ratios to translate his concepts onto the enormous stone. There were disadvantages to working alone. On some days, when a certain muscle wouldn't look right, or the marble showed an unexpected flaw, doubt would creep in like morning fog. At times, Michel would dedicate whole days to carving and recarving a single finger until it reached the level of perfection he had imagined. His hands were permanently discoloured, his back hurt from looking up all the time, and he became known for being antisocial, though this was partially due to the fact that he simply had no time for socialising. It was a slow breakthrough. Months went by, and David's shape appeared on the stone like a sunrise cresting hills. The fundamental form came first, followed by the definition of the muscles and features, and lastly the amazing detail that gave the appearance of living flesh to marble. Michel focused particularly on David's eyes, which still appear to track movement, and his hands, which were large to highlight his humanity and resolve. By 1504, word had gotten out that something extraordinary was taking place in that workshop in Florence. The response was swift and overwhelming when David was finally unveiled by officials. Crowds of citizens gathered merely to gaze. To learn the technique, artists travelled from all over Italy. Even people who knew nothing about art could sense they were seeing something that would outlive them all. But then came a delightful problem. Where to put a 17-foot naked man? David was supposed to be positioned high on the cathedral, but the sculpture was too magnificent to be concealed on a rooftop. The placement was discussed by a commission of citizens and artists, including Leonardo da Vinci, who had his own views. As a representation of the power of the Republic, some wanted David to stand in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. Others favoured a more secure area. The topic of politics came up. Like David and Goliath, Florence was a republic encircled by hostile territories. The sculpture came to represent democratic principles opposing oppression. When David was eventually erected in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, it was both an artistic and a political statement. The installation was a feat of engineering. Using an intricate system of ropes and wooden rollers, 40 men moved David the half-mile from the workshop to the piazza over the course of 4 days. The procession turned into an unplanned celebration of civic pride as people gathered in the streets to watch. Michel, who was now 29, had given Florence an icon in addition to a sculpture. In addition to his artistic accomplishments, David embodied the Renaissance belief that anyone could achieve anything with talent, bravery, and willpower. As you fall asleep, imagine the moment when the scaffolding was finally taken down, and David was standing there in all his splendour, prepared to take on any giants the world might send. Something happens that completely upends everything you believe to be true about yourself, just when you think life has settled into a comfortable pattern. Pope Julius II, who combined the artistic aspirations of Lorenzo de' Medici, the temperament of a Renaissance warlord, and the spiritual authority of the papacy, was the source of that disruption for Michel. In order to design and sculpt a massive tomb that would rival the monuments of the ancient emperors, Julius had called Michel to Rome. With dozens of figures adorning the 3-story marble masterpiece, Michel spent months making models and drawings. His sculpture legacy would be the work of a lifetime. Then Julius had second thoughts. Imagine Michel's annoyance. Your guests decide they would rather have pizza after you've prepared the perfect dinner party, purchased all the necessary supplies, and begun cooking. The Pope was the guest in this instance, though, and you couldn't exactly dispute papal authority. Julius came up with a novel idea. He wanted Michel to paint the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. Michel objected, "But I'm a sculptor." And he was correct. He had little experience painting, and he'd never tried anything as large as Julius had in mind. 68 feet above the ground, the Sistine Chapel's ceiling covered more than 5,000 square feet of curved surface. Lying on your back would be like painting the interior of a cathedral. Michel's worries didn't interest Julius. Discussions were short and obedience was expected when the Pope made a request. According to some historians, Bramante, the Pope's architect, suggested Michel for the project despite the fact that it was all but impossible, possibly in the hopes that the sculptor would falter and withdraw from the race for Julius's favour. If that's the case, they misjudged Michel's stubbornness. In 1508, Michel was 33 years old and looking up at a ceiling that seemed to go on forever, trying to figure out how to turn plain plaster into the most amazing painted surface in Christian art. He would have to come up with ways to paint above without getting blinded by paint dripping in his eyes, design scaffolding that wouldn't collapse, and somehow come up with a cohesive composition that made sense from 68 feet below. The topic was just as intimidating. Julius wanted prophets, sibyls, and hundreds of other characters to surround scenes from Genesis, such as the creation of the world, Adam and Eve, and Noah's flood. It was more than just a painting. It was a comprehensive theological program that had to function as both separate scenes and a cohesive whole. Reasoning that he would begin the story chronologically, Michel started with the flood scene. However, it was extremely challenging to work overhead while lying on scaffolding. His neck ached from the awkward position, paint dripped continuously, and the figures he thought were flawless up close looked warped down from floor level. He struggled for weeks before scraping everything off and starting over. This time, working backward through Genesis, he started with God distinguishing between light and darkness. He created clever methods, such as thickening his paint mixtures to minimize dripping, making cartoon templates to project designs onto the ceiling, and modifying proportions to take the viewing angle into consideration. Most significantly, he discovered that the ceiling was an architectural space that could give the impression of depth and movement rather than a flat surface. The work took up all of his time. During his 4 years as a painter, he frequently worked by himself in the chapel after dark, using only candles for illumination. Every brushstroke of those magnificent figures was created by his hand, but his assistants prepared the paints and cartoons. His own lamentable poem about becoming a hunchback from looking up all the time describes the chronic neck and back pain he developed that would follow him for the rest of his life. Psychological pressure matched the physical toll. Julius would show up out of the blue, scaling the scaffolding to check on progress and give unsolicited advice. The Pope was impatient, constantly asking when the work would be finished. Michel almost got hit with Julius's walking stick for his well-known reply, "When it's finished." But over time, magic occurred. Figures of amazing beauty and strength started to emerge from the ceiling. His god wasn't the distant, symbolic deity of medieval art, but a dynamic creator sweeping through space with cosmic energy. The most well-known gesture in art history is Adam's awakening touch. The flat ceiling became a vision of heaven as the prophets and sibyls appeared to occupy actual architectural spaces. The way all of these components came together was the most amazing accomplishment. visitors could follow the creation story while being awed by the individual figures' exquisite beauty as they read the ceiling from the chapel floor, which resembled a huge illuminated manuscript. Tonight, as you close your eyes, picture Michel standing atop that scaffolding, exhausted and covered in paint, producing pictures that will awe future generations. Every great endeavour has a turning point when you take stock and discover that you've produced something that even you were surprised by. When the scaffolding was eventually taken down in October 1512, Michelangelo was able to see the finished Sistine Chapel ceiling for the first time from the ground floor, just like any other visitor who might happen to wander in from the Roman streets. The unveiling was a combination of religious ceremony, political theatre, and art exhibition, as one might anticipate from a papal event in Renaissance Rome. In their finest robes, cardinals and diplomats assembled, artists travelled from all over Italy to observe what everyone knew would be unprecedented, and inquisitive Romans flocked outside to catch a glimpse of what their city's master had achieved. There was an instantaneous and profound silence as those heavy wooden doors opened and the crowd filed in. When something is so exquisite that it leaves people speechless, do you know what I mean? That's precisely what took place. Standing with their necks craned back and their mouths open, grown men who had lived their entire lives surrounded by art attempted to take in what they were witnessing. The ceiling had been turned into a window to heaven, not just painted. Michel had created an architectural illusion so convincing that visitors felt they were looking up through actual stone frameworks at real figures inhabiting celestial space. Each scene, God sweeping the cosmos, Adam waking up, Eve emerging from Adam's side, was flawless on its own, but they all came together like the movements of a symphony. Of course, Pope Julius was victorious. He had commissioned the piece for political as well as artistic reasons, demonstrating to the world that Papal Rome was capable of creating wonders on par with those of classical antiquity. However, Julius appeared astonished by the accomplishments of his erratic sculptor. Undoubtedly, the ceiling was propaganda, but it was propaganda of such sublime beauty that it took on a much higher significance. As usual, Michel was already planning his next endeavour. He was still essentially a sculptor, even though the 4 years of painting had been an unusual diversion. He desired to go back to the marble statues that had been patiently waiting in Julius's workshop to his tomb. But like popes, Julius had other ideas. The relationship between Michel and Julius was fascinating to observe. Both of them had strong wills, were ardent art lovers, and were completely confident in their own abilities. Their arguments were legendary. At one point, Michel actually left Rome and had to be brought back by papal apologies. However, they were able to understand one another in the way that challenging people occasionally do. Despite his complaints, Michel flourished under the pressure of impossible commissions, and Julius saw genius where he saw it. Michel likely believed that he would finally be able to work on his own projects after Julius's death in 1513. Michel had been raised in the Medici family, so it should have been good news that he was now dealing with the new Pope Leo X, who was a Medici. But Leo had his own artistic vision and his own favourite artists, including Raphael, who was painting the papal apartments while Michel was working overhead in the Sistine Chapel. The rivalry with Raphael gives Michel's story a humorous side plot. Charming, tactful, at ease around customers, and capable of running sizable workshops, Raphael was everything Michel wasn't. Raphael was hosting elegant dinner parties and graciously accepting commission after commission, while Michel was up on scaffolding covered in paint, complaining about papal meddling. Nonetheless, the two artists valued one another's creations. Although he would never publicly acknowledge it, Michel valued Raphael's compositional abilities and technical innovations, and Raphael used elements he had learned from studying Michel's ceiling in his own paintings. It was the kind of high-level professional rivalry that motivates both sides to achieve more. Leo X wanted Michelangelo to be involved in the facade design of St. Peter's Basilica, because he had big plans for it. One of the most frustrating periods in Michel's career resulted from this. Years of building architectural models and drawings, visiting marble quarries, and setting up workshops, only to have the project shelved when papal funds ran out. Michel had made promises, signed contracts, and hired staff, and all of that vanished overnight due to politics at the Vatican. Michel learned a valuable lesson about the risky nature of artistic patronage from these papal letdowns. Money vanished, priorities shifted, and popes passed away. He needed to choose projects more carefully and guard against the whims of influential patrons if he hoped to produce work that would last. But his reputation was set in stone by the Sistine ceiling. People travelled from all over Europe to witness it. It was the subject of intense study by other artists who sought to comprehend his methods. Poets started writing about it. Michel had accomplished something that goes beyond typical artistic achievement. He had produced art that people would travel great distances to view. As sleep draws near tonight, imagine those first viewers in the Sistine Chapel, their faces lit by candlelight, looking up in awe at pictures that seem to make Genesis come to life. Mastery in one area frequently leads to unexpected opportunities in other areas, a lesson that life has a way of imparting to us. Michel experienced this lesson dramatically in his later years. New challenges that would push him well beyond his comfort zone and uncover talents he was unaware he possessed came as he approached his 50s, old age by Renaissance standards. When Pope Clement VII asked him to design a library, it was the first surprise. The Laurentian Library in Florence, a groundbreaking facility that would house the Medici family's priceless manuscript collection, was not just any library. Similar to his approach to sculpture, Michel viewed architecture as an expression of the fundamental character of a building rather than as ornamentation. His design was audacious. With its rows of wooden reading desks and well-proportioned windows that let in soft light, the reading room resembled the serene hull of a ship. However, his true genius was displayed in the vestibule at the entrance. With steps that curved and divided in ways that gave the impression that stone was liquid, he constructed a staircase that appeared to flow like frozen lava. Even now, visitors still stop on those stairs, feeling as though they are viewing architecture as sculpture. It was both happy and sad to work in Florence once more. The city of his youth had changed. Political upheavals had scattered old friends, and the optimistic humanism of his early years had been tempered by war, plague, and religious reformation. Michel's interest in poetry grew, and he began penning verses that showed a more reflective side of himself. His poems weren't masterpieces, but they were deeply personal, exploring themes of aging, faith, and the meaning of artistic creation. Vittoria Colonna, a remarkable woman who was a poet, religious reformer, and intellectual force in her own right, became one of his most significant friends during this time. Their deep, spiritual bond, founded on a mutual interest in poetry, art, and religious issues, was unique for its time. Few people ever faced the intellectual challenges that Michel faced from Vittoria, and their correspondence shows a gentle, thoughtful side of the great artist. When Vittoria died in 1547, Michel was devastated. At 72, when most men of his age had long since passed away, he was grieving the loss of a person who had recognised his art and his inner turmoil. He was questioning everything at the time of her death, including his faith, his artistic legacy, and the significance of his worldly success, which had brought him fame but not necessarily peace. Pope Paul III asked him to paint a scene of the Last Judgment on the Sistine Chapel's altar wall during this depressing time. Michel was hesitant because the chapel already held his best painting. He was a sculptor first and foremost, and the subject matter required him to confront uncomfortable, personal themes of death and divine justice. However, his most emotionally impactful painting turned out to be The Last Judgment. The hopeful humanism of the ceiling had vanished, to be replaced by a more sombre picture of humanity being held ultimately responsible. His Christ figure is a strong judge whose gesture separates the saved from the damned, not the kind redeemer of traditional art. With figures rising toward salvation, or falling toward damnation, in a cosmic drama that filled the entire wall, the composition whirls with movement and emotion. The painting immediately sparked controversy. His figures, according to some critics, were too intense, too muscular, and too nude for a place of worship. Michel's strong humanistic vision was becoming outdated as the Counter-Reformation got underway, and new restrictions were placed on religious art. He became known as the underwear painter, because later artists would actually paint draperies over some of his figures. The criticism didn't matter to Michel. He painted not for the acclaim of the day, but for God and future generations. His mature view of human nature was embodied in The Last Judgment. He was profoundly aware of both human potential and human frailty, without being cynically pessimistic or naively optimistic. Having been named chief architect in 1547, he was also supervising the building of the new saint, Peter's Basilica, creating a structure that would represent Christianity while resolving massive engineering and design issues was possibly his biggest architectural challenge. His solution, a huge dome that would dominate the Roman skyline and serve as an inspiration for cathedral builders for centuries, was characteristically audacious. His last years were spent working on St. Peter's. He approached the project with the commitment of someone who knew it would be his last masterpiece and refused payment, believing it to be a service to God. By fusing traditional proportions with cutting-edge engineering, the dome's design produced a building that was both technically outstanding and spiritually uplifting. As you drift off to sleep, picture Michel in his 70s, still scaling scaffolding, pushing the envelope, and finding new ways to use paint and stone to further his endless creative vision. Seeing a great artist face their own mortality while continuing to create with unwavering passion is incredibly moving. This is precisely the story that Michel's last decades tell. A man in his 70s and 80s who never slowed down, who continued to push boundaries despite his body reminding him every day that he was, after all, human. Michel was 75 years old by 1550, which is nearly unthinkable for a person born in the 15th century. His peers were mostly long dead. Raphael had passed away in 1520, and Leonardo in 1519. In addition to his artistic competitors, Michel had outlived entire generations of admirers, critics, and patrons. Nevertheless, he kept up his work on St. Peter's Basilica with the vigour of a man half his age. His last obsession, and what an obsession it was the dome of St. Peter's. Not only was he designing a roof, but he was also building what would become Rome's most iconic silhouette. A building so precisely proportioned that it appears to hover over the Vatican like a visible prayer. How to support that much weight at that height, while designing an interior space that inspires rather than intimidates, was a huge engineering challenge. As usual, Michel came up with a creative solution. He created a double-shell dome, with an outer dome that would form the external profile, and an inner dome that guests would see from inside the basilica. This enabled him to maximise the architectural impact on the outside, as well as the spiritual experience within. Despite the dome's 452-foot elevation, it feels cosy and protective from within rather than intimidating. Delegating more than Michel had ever felt comfortable with was necessary to work on such a large project in his last years. He had to entrust assistants with details that he would have insisted on carving himself earlier in his career. For someone who had always felt that only his own hand could accomplish the perfection he desired, this was both challenging and freeing. While others took care of the execution, he could concentrate on the big picture. During these years, his poetry increased in frequency and intimacy. For him, writing verses was similar to sketching. It allowed him to process thoughts and feelings without the physical strain of painting or carving. His poems show a man struggling with issues that success was unable to resolve, such as what happens to people when they die. Given eternity, what purpose do accomplishments on earth serve? How does an artist get ready to abandon incomplete pieces? One of his most poignant final poems questions his art directly, asking whether all of his painted scenes and marble figures were merely a diversion from deeper spiritual issues, or if they were actually prayers. This was no pretense. Michel truly questioned whether his life's work had made him more or less like God. Ironically, some were acknowledging his work as possibly the greatest artistic accomplishment in human history, while Michel was doubting its spiritual worth. People travelled from all over Europe to view his artwork. His methods were assiduously studied by young artists. While he was still alive, authors started writing biographies, treating him as a living legend. This attention was both rewarding and taxing for Michel. Always a recluse who felt more at ease with marble than with people, he was suddenly expected to play the part of a Renaissance master for a never-ending parade of admirers. He became known for being rough with guests, but those who knew him well saw this as shyness rather than conceit. 3 weeks before his 89th birthday on February 18th, 1564, Michel passed away quietly at home in Rome. Even though he had been feeling ill for a few days, he had nearly finished the architectural drawings for St. Peter's. Witnesses claim that his final remarks discussed finishing the dome. Even as he was dying, he was contemplating unfinished business. He had completely changed Renaissance culture, as evidenced by the immediate reaction to his death. As a church prince, Pope Pius IV wanted him to be buried in St. Peter's. His body was ordered to be returned to his birthplace by the city of Florence. In Rome, artists started organising ornate funeral rituals. An era came to an end with Michel's passing. He was no longer just an artist, but a cultural force. His impact goes well beyond art history. You can see Michel's legacy every time you see a government building with a classical dome. He helped create the concepts that are echoed whenever someone discusses the divine spark of creativity. Artists are always imitating him when they refuse to sacrifice their vision for financial gain. As you fall asleep, visualize Michel's dome rising over Rome in the evening light, a monument to one man's conviction that people are capable of producing art that endures for centuries, monuments that bridge the gap between earthly craft and eternal aspiration, and beauty that surpasses empires. Dream sweet dreams. Frederic Chopin's story begins in the modest village of Żelazowa Wola, Poland, where he was born around March 1st, 1810, though some documents note February 22nd. The region was steeped in cultural richness and political upheaval, with Warsaw nearby and the territory under the shadow of the Russian Empire. Chopin's father, Nicholas, was a Frenchman, teaching language and manners to Polish nobility, while his mother, Justina, was a Polish gentlewoman whose calm sense of tradition anchored their household. In that setting, Polish folklore mingled with European musical forms. Even in infancy, Chopin absorbed these influences, as if the rhythmic footsteps of villagers and distant folk melodies wove into his subconscious. Though unremarkable at first glance, the family's small home resonated with reverence for art. The piano, a battered upright, became young Frederic's first beloved companion, opening onto imaginative worlds he'd conjure in quiet mornings. Around 6, Chopin's prodigious talent drew attention from family friends and local aristocrats. In a society that revered salon culture, a gifted child at the piano was mythic. He played short pieces at gatherings, shyly but assuredly, winning over curious onlookers who watched in mild disbelief. Even then, his playing transcended mere youthful charm. He displayed a depth that hinted at hidden wells of sensitivity. His teacher, Wojciech Żywny, noted the boy's special relationship with melody, which seemed to flow through him without the stiffness typical of child prodigies. Beyond his domestic sphere, Poland itself was navigating a fragile identity. The Napoleonic Wars had left scars across Europe. Although too young to grasp politics, Chopin sensed the patriotism and longing carried by adults around him. Through his mother's lullabies and whispered family stories, the notion of a lost homeland became a melodic thread weaving through his emerging consciousness. Chopin's sister, Ludwika, often joined him at the piano. Family duets turned into moments of shared creativity, honing Frederic's ability to communicate through sound. Here, his earliest compositions took shape, short, sometimes clumsy preludes to the refined expressions he would later craft. Yet these embryonic works already displayed what would become his hallmark: graceful lines and a certain bittersweet tension between major and minor. He performed publicly for the first time around age 7, playing a concert in Warsaw. Though such appearances could be dismissed as novelty, Chopin avoided the fate of child prodigies who fade once the novelty wanes. He possessed a seriousness and poetic restraint rare in children. Observers began to regard him as a symbol of Poland's hopes, a delicate, steadfast light for a land overshadowed by external forces. Despite the growing acclaim, the Chopin household valued stability. Nicholas and Justina refused to exploit their son's talent, allowing only select performances while ensuring a rigorous academic education. Literature, history, and language formed the backdrop to Chopin's musical studies, broadening his imagination and refining his sensibilities. Piano practice remained constant, punctuating daily life. Occasionally, he would present a short polonaise or mazurka at family gatherings, each piece tinged with local rhythms, reframed through his evolving style. Youthful curiosity led him beyond his surroundings. Brief visits to Warsaw introduced a more cosmopolitan musical scene. Though still young, he encountered professional musicians, aristocrats, and intellectuals in salons. These glimpses of city life left a strong impression. He realized that an artistic future might extend beyond village confines. Yet he retained a deep tie to Poland's cultural soul. This duality, rooted in Poland's provincial heart while edging toward Europe's wider possibilities, would shape his entire career. For the moment, though, he was just a boy at the piano, enthralled by the promise of music that echoed far beyond any single room. Whispers about this gentle prodigy stirred questions. Could he be Poland's next great musical figure, a voice of national identity wrapped in delicate harmonies? Only time, and Chopin's unfolding genius would reveal the answer. In these formative years, no one could anticipate the complex trajectory that lay ahead. But in the whispers of the local gatherings where merchants and travelling performers converged, an unspoken consensus emerged. Young Frederic was different, far from the typical parlour show-off. He conveyed a delicate empathy through his keyboard that spoke to people's private joys and sorrows. Each note he played seemed to carry a gentle sense of yearning, as though bridging the gap between ephemeral childhood and the adult complexities lurking beyond the horizon. His parents, though pleased by the modest celebrity he garnered, were deeply protective. Those who watched felt stirred in his recitals, as if Poland spoke through his hands. Chopin's teenage years were marked by a widening world, one in which he began to see the possibilities and pressures that came with his growing reputation. By the time he was in his early teens, Warsaw itself had become a kind of secondary classroom. He frequented the city more often, absorbing the salon culture in ways that surpassed mere piano demonstrations. He observed how aristocrats, intellectuals, and artists interacted, not just in the formal sense of performance, but in their private, candid conversations about politics, literature, and the future of the nation perpetually under watch. In these salon gatherings, Chopin was at first a curiosity, an unassuming, somewhat delicate figure who produced music that seemed too profound for his youthful appearance. But as he refined his style, he earned respect as a musician, rather than just a novelty. His performances, often intimate affairs, displayed a sensitivity that was starting to take shape in his original compositions. While still shaped by the classical frameworks he'd studied, his work also blended Polish musical elements with a new harmonic language. This evolution thrilled those who heard him, and the novelty of his youth gave way to genuine admiration of his craft. By 1826, Chopin enrolled at the Warsaw Conservatory under Józef Elsner. Elsner, a composer of some renown, recognized the uniqueness of his students' musical instincts. Rather than imposing rigid expectations, Elsner fostered a gentle discipline, guiding Chopin toward an understanding of form and counterpoint that would serve as the backbone for his stylistic experimentation. In so doing, Elsner fulfilled two crucial roles. He acted both as a guardrail, preventing Chopin from drifting into mere fanciful improvisations, and as a doorway, encouraging the young musician to trust his own artistic impulses. Yet Chopin's life in Warsaw was not all about study. He mingled with peers, engaged in spirited debates, and, according to some letters, even enjoyed the light-hearted distractions typical of youth: dances, outdoor excursions, late-night banter. This balance between earnest scholarship and playful socializing kept him grounded. Friends who remembered him from that time recalled a gentle, witty personality who could draw out laughter just as easily as tears with his piano playing. Still, a restlessness stirred within him. Poland's political situation seemed forever precarious, and he felt a tug to experience life beyond Warsaw's boundaries. A trip to Berlin in 1828 offered a hint of what awaited him outside his homeland. Though brief, it introduced him to broader circles of culture and music, sparking a sense of wanderlust. Upon returning, he began formulating plans to travel more extensively, both for artistic growth and for practical reasons. Warsaw, supportive though it was, could only offer so much in terms of career prospects. In 1829, he journeyed to Vienna, the Austrian capital, with its illustrious musical lineage. Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert was a magnet for ambitious young composers. Chopin found himself in a bustling hub where concerts and operas were daily fare. Overwhelmed yet inspired, he tested his mettle by giving performances, each carefully arranged to capitalize on the city's appetite for novelty. Although he was met with critical approval, he also confronted the reality that audiences here were accustomed to spectacle and virtuosity on a grand scale. Chopin's style, intimate and subtly shaded, was unusual by comparison. Nonetheless, local critics praised his nuanced touch and originality. Encouraged, he contemplated making Vienna his base for a longer stretch, but events in Poland soon demanded his attention. Rumours of upheaval floated through Europe, hinting that the Polish struggle for autonomy might erupt into open conflict. Torn between an ambition to explore foreign stages and loyalty to his homeland, Chopin briefly returned to Warsaw in late 1830. Around that time, the November Uprising, an armed rebellion against Russian rule, shattered the foundations of Polish society. While Chopin debated his next steps, friends and family urged him to secure his future abroad, believing that fulfilling his musical potential would serve Poland's cultural pride just as effectively as taking up arms. Thus began the departure that would define his life. In the autumn of 1830, Chopin left Poland for Vienna once again, carrying with him a small box of earth from his native soil, an emblem of his deep attachment to his homeland. As he travelled, he felt a swirl of emotions: excitement, trepidation, sorrow. He watched the landscapes shift as he crossed borders, his piano improvisations echoing the uncertainties of a life in transit. Yet at this point, few realised how profoundly this step would echo in Chopin's life. By the early 1830s, Paris had emerged as the glittering epicentre of European art, intellect and revolution. For Frederic Chopin, who recently arrived from Poland in turmoil, the city felt both overwhelming and inviting. He entered a community of writers, painters and fellow composers, all converging in the capital's salons, those vibrant, often unpredictable hives of conversation and performance. To a young exile burdened by homesickness, Paris offered both a refuge and a blank canvas on which to shape his public identity. Almost immediately, Chopin sensed the city's dual nature. It was as much a whirlwind of self-promotion and social manoeuvring as it was a crucible of high art. Hostesses of these gatherings vied for intriguing guests, and initially, Chopin's Polish origins and refined keyboard approach made him a sought-after novelty. Yet he soon learned that success in Paris demanded more than raw talent. It required a flair for presentation and the ability to navigate cliques. Determined to avoid being overshadowed by showier performers, he maintained his intimate style while allowing curious audiences to glimpse his romantic mystique. Fortunately, his music spoke on his behalf. Listeners were entranced by the delicate interplay of melody and harmony that defined his early works. Paris, still reeling from the July Revolution and swept up in a romantic fervour, was primed to celebrate emotion in art. Chopin's pieces, simultaneously subtle and impassioned, fit this cultural moment. Amid the murmur of conversation in cramped drawing rooms, he introduced a distinctly Polish flavour through his mazurkas and polonaises. These forms, coloured by folk rhythms and patriotic longing, offered a window into a homeland many Parisians knew little about. However, achieving financial stability was not an effortless task. Chopin turned to teaching piano, an enterprise he approached with meticulous care. Unlike typical drills, his lessons emphasized musical poetry, guiding students to hear the emotional undercurrent in every phrase. News of his abilities as an instructor spread, and soon wealthy families sought him out. Teaching, though time-consuming, ensured a steady income that freed him from the strain of large-scale concertizing, a format he never fully embraced. Indeed, Chopin's preferred venue was not the grand concert hall, but the intimate salon, where he could sense the subtle reactions of a small audience. His approach, sometimes described as whisper-like, asked listeners to lean in rather than lean back. Critics who anticipated bravura criticized him for his lack of force. Yet among the growing group of admirers, there was consensus that force was never his aim. In an era enthralled by personal expression, Chopin's delicate phrasing offered a different kind of power, one that was internal, reflective, and quietly revolutionary. During these formative years in Paris, he forged relationships that would shape his legacy. One such bond developed with Franz Liszt, a flamboyant Hungarian pianist whose colossal sound and stage theatrics contrasted sharply with the Chopin's reserve. Nevertheless, the two men found common ground, admiring each other's artistry and occasionally playing together. Their contrasting styles reflected the diversity of romantic music, Liszt's dramatic scale balanced by the Chopin's interior landscapes. Chopin also crossed paths with figures like Hector Berlioz, whose sweeping symphonies embodied the era's thirst for grandeur. While their creative visions diverged, these encounters deepened Chopin's understanding of music's many possibilities. In a city teeming with restless minds, he soaked up discussions of aesthetics, politics, and philosophy. Late-night gatherings could spark friendships or feuds, but for Chopin they offered continual insight into the forces shaping contemporary thought. Yet under the polished routine of teaching and performing, Chopin carried the weight of displacement. Letters reveal his lingering sorrow over Poland's struggles, an ache that wove itself into his most poignant compositions. Even as he gained acclaim in Paris, He wrestled with guilt at having left his homeland. This tension between a new life of opportunity and an old world in turmoil fueled his artistic spirit. Ultimately, it was this confluence of exile and acceptance, longing and fulfillment, that birthed his most enduring works. In the midst of this growing success, however, Chopin had no inkling that a dramatic personal relationship would soon reshape his life in ways even his music could barely foretell. It was within these circles of artists and intellectuals that Chopin encountered the writer George Sand, a presence as paradoxical and complex as the city itself. Born Aurore Dupin, she had already garnered both fame and notoriety for her unconventional lifestyle, adopting a man's attire and openly criticising social norms. Their first meeting, arranged by mutual friends, was anything but ideal. Sand's boldness startled Chopin, likewise. His delicate demeanour struck her as a feat. Yet beneath this awkward first impression, a shared sensibility lingered, hinting that fate had set them on a path of entanglement. Though their initial interactions were marked by tension, curiosity eventually eroded wariness. At salons, Sand listened to Chopin's performances with quiet intensity, fascinated by the subtle passion woven into his nocturnes and preludes. For her part, Chopin discovered in Sand's writing a candour that both unsettled and intrigued him. She wrote with emotional force, challenging societal expectations in a way he, a more introverted figure, could only express through music. In time, this mutual fascination evolved into a relationship that defied easy classification. Some saw it as scandalous, others romanticised it, envisioning two rebellious souls uniting under the banner of art. Sand's familial obligations, she was a mother with complex ties to past lovers, clashed with Chopin's need for a stable, tranquil environment. Yet for several years, they carved out a shared existence, spending summers at Sand's estate in Nohant, where Chopin found the kind of peace impossible to attain in Paris. The manor's sprawling gardens and rustic atmosphere gave him the space to compose free from urban pressures. Meanwhile, Sand continued to write feverishly, fueling her own literary output in parallel. This period yielded some of Chopin's most refined compositions. He built upon his previous works, deepening their emotional range while drawing further on Polish influences, especially in his mazurkas. The synergy with Sand took a curious form. She stoked his creative fires by allowing him solitude, yet providing companionship when he needed it. The letters from that era reveal a mixture of affection and exasperation, as they attempted to reconcile two strong-willed temperaments with distinct worldviews. Chopin's health, already delicate, showed further signs of strain. He suffered from persistent coughing fits and fevers, likely tied to a chronic pulmonary ailment. The exact nature of his condition remains debated, though tuberculosis is the commonly suggested culprit. At Nohant, Sand took on the role of caregiver, even as she juggled her responsibilities to her children. The tranquil setting was both therapeutic and creatively stimulating. However, the underlying tensions in their partnership never fully disappeared. Despite these strains, they managed to maintain a semblance of harmony, returning to Paris for the social season and hosting a circle of admirers, including artists who found their alliance captivating. Rumours and speculations made the rounds, some exaggerated, others tinged with envy. Chopin, quieter by nature, often let Sand handle social negotiations. Her judgment-free nature and ability to navigate bohemian society made her well suited to do so. During their years together, Chopin continued to refine his technique. His works from this phase, nocturnes, waltzes, impromptus, resonate with a delicate balance between introspection and theatrical flair. He pushed the boundaries of harmony, exploring key changes that felt as subtle as shifting moods. Audiences in Paris, who by then revered him as a singular voice on the piano, embraced these developments eagerly. However, when personal conflicts flared, the same artistic brilliance that flowed in times of peace could also come to a halt. Gradually, the relationship showed signs of fracture. Sand's practicality clashed with Chopin's artistic fragility, especially as financial and familial burdens multiplied. Their differing life philosophies became harder to reconcile. Sand championed unconstrained freedom, while Chopin yearned for emotional security. Friends noticed simmering tension. Chopin's circle worried about his health, Sand's acquaintances questioned her choices. Neither could ignore the gathering clouds. Still, for a while longer, They sustained a delicate equilibrium, each day a tapestry of quiet idylls and small quarrels, softened by the hush of the French countryside. Their bond gave birth to cultural ripples that extended beyond their personal story. The fusion of literary boldness and musical nuance sparked curiosity in those who orbited their world. The question was not if their union would end, but how the inevitable parting would unfold, and what toll it would take on the Chopin spirit, which had grown accustomed to Sand's presence as both muse and caretaker. As the 1840s advanced, tensions between Chopin and George Sand deepened. Conflicting needs frayed their once productive coexistence, culminating in disagreements that seemed trivial to outsiders but deeply impacted their bond. Financial strains became more pronounced. Although Chopin was still giving private lessons and occasionally performing, his medical expenses increased, and his capacity to maintain the rigorous schedule of a sought-after musician waned. Sand's responsibilities piled higher. She was not just an acclaimed novelist, but also a mother whose children demanded her attention. Their seasonal retreats to Nahant were initially meant to be restorative, yet the countryside that once soothed them now became a backdrop for brooding silences and unspoken resentments. Chopin, increasingly plagued by ill health, found it difficult to cope with the emotional upheavals. Sand, for her part, struggled to reconcile her desire for independence with the role of caregiver and mediator. The earlier idyll of two artists inspiring each other gave way to a fragile piece held together by habit and reluctance to confront the inevitable. By 1846, arguments over the upbringing of Sand's children, particularly her daughter Solange, magnified the couple's disparities. Sand believed Chopin was overstepping his boundaries. He, in turn, felt marginalised in a household he had come to consider partly his own. As from this period paint a picture of two individuals trying to salvage a relationship that had lost its guiding clarity. The closeness that once nurtured Chopin's compositions and fueled Sand's writing now felt stifling, each partner perceiving the other as a barrier to personal freedom. When the final break came, it was less an explosive rupture than a slow unravelling. They were practically living apart by 1847. Their friends, once enchanted by the bohemian aura of their union, looked on with sympathy or weary resignation, depending on whose side they took. Though not bitterly acrimonious, the separation left Chopin emotionally drained at a time when he most needed stability. And then, broader European unrest intervened. The year 1848 ushered in revolutions across the continent. France, Austria, and various Italian states erupted in anti-monarchical fervour. Paris was engulfed by turmoil, with barricades springing up and many aristocratic families fleeing. Chopin's student base shrank dramatically, intensifying his financial worries. Weakened and anxious, he began to consider leaving the city, when a British admirer, Jane Stirling, invited him to London, promising new opportunities for performance and patronage. Chopin decided to accept, despite reservations about travel with his frail health. London welcomed him with a mix of curiosity and scepticism. In a musical scene dominated by large-scale concerts, Chopin's subtle approach found appreciative audiences, but did not ignite a mainstream frenzy. He gave a handful of performances, enough to dazzle connoisseurs and uphold his reputation. Though the city's bustling pace and cold, damp climate took a toll. Searching for respite, he travelled north to Scotland, where patrons offered lodging in their country homes. The bleak landscapes, while novel, did little to alleviate his mounting exhaustion. Letters from this period reveal his despair over deteriorating health and the emotional wounds of separation from Sand. He was haunted by memories of earlier, more optimistic days in Paris. The sense of exile he once felt upon leaving Poland now returned with even greater poignancy. Ironically, he was closer geographically to his homeland than ever before, yet felt more spiritually adrift. His performances, though still meticulous, lack the spark of earlier years. Composing came in fits and starts, yielding a few remarkable late works, but each effort drained his waning strength. By late 1848, Chopin concluded that London could not be a permanent refuge. He returned to Paris early the following year, an ailing figure who could no longer rely on teaching or concerts to sustain himself. Friends rallied to his aid, offering financial support and companionship. Still, each passing week saw him grow weaker, confined mostly to his apartment. Occasional visitors recalled the quiet dignity with which he faced his final decline. maintaining a gentle politeness and concern for others' comfort. He clung to whatever creative impulses remained, sometimes improvising a few notes at the piano, though coughing fits often cut these sessions short. Aware of the seriousness of his condition, Chopin is said to have asked for Mozart's Requiem to be performed at his funeral. The end came on October 17th, 1849, when he died at age 39. Mourners gathered at the Church of the Madeleine to pay tribute. His sister Ludwika, who had journeyed from Poland to be with him, arranged for his heart to be returned to Warsaw, a final testament to the love he bore for his homeland. The rest of his remains were interred at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. In the hush that followed, those who knew him contemplated the delicate threads he wove between Poland, France, and the universal language of music, a tapestry that now, with his passing, felt both achingly complete and painfully unfinished. In the days and weeks after Chopin's death, Parisian society buzzed with reminiscences, myths, and debates over his true nature. Was he the epitome of the romantic, willing to sacrifice his health for the sake of art? Or was he a more measured figure, quietly shaping the course of piano music without fanfare? His friends, former lovers, and students offered conflicting portraits, a mosaic of impressions that underscored the complexity of a life lived in the margins between public scrutiny and private longing. Already, fellow composers and critics were assessing his legacy. Franz Liszt, who had championed Chopin's works, penned a biography that blended admiration with a certain poetic license. Hector Berlioz credited him with renewing the expressive power of the piano. Robert Schumann, based in Germany, had long praised Chopin's gift for capturing entire worlds of feeling in miniature forms. While the scope of Chopin's output was modest compared to symphonists or opera composers, its influence proved outsized, a testament to the intimacy he brought to every bar of music. Pianists marvelled at the technical innovations embedded in his etudes, preludes and nocturnes. Chopin transformed the piano into an instrument of whispered confidence rather than a bombastic display. His approach to fingering, pedal usage, and phrasing forced performers to abandon purely mechanical methods. Instead, they were compelled to inhabit the emotional core of each piece, a requirement that made playing Chopin both a challenge and a revelation. Yet not everyone grasped his significance immediately. Some critics, particularly those captivated by grand orchestral works, perceived his oeuvre as devoid of grandeur. They questioned whether these delicate sketches deserved the same reverence accorded to symphonies. Over time, however, that perspective evolved. Younger generations of composers recognized that Chopin's genius lay precisely in his ability to convey epic feeling through slender forms. The preludes, each a miniature universe, gained particular acclaim for their structural and harmonic daring. Even Liszt's transcriptions of Chopin's works could not replicate the subtlety that defined Chopin's own playing. In Poland, still grappling with political subjugation, Chopin's music became a beacon of cultural identity. His polonaises, with their regal, march-like rhythms, and mazurkas, echoing the rustic dance forms of rural Poland, resonated with those yearning for national dignity. Over time, entire generations of Poles would point to Chopin as the embodiment of a spirit unbroken by foreign rule. In this sense, his legacy took on a patriotic dimension, turning him into a symbolic guardian of the Polish soul. While he spent much of his adulthood in Paris, his heart, both literally and figuratively, remained in Warsaw, ensuring that his reputation at home was burnished by an almost holy reverence. Beyond Poland's borders, Chopin's influence quietly seeped into the DNA of Western music. Claude Debussy and Gabriel Fauré, major French composers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, drew upon his nuanced approach to harmony. Even Russian composers like Alexander Scriabin found inspiration in Chopin's coloristic chords. In the realm of piano performance, his legacy manifested in the demand that interpretation be a delicate art of shading and personal expression. Pianists from across Europe, and eventually the world, travelled to Paris or Warsaw to study Chopin's style firsthand. One of the more intriguing aspects of his posthumous fame was the almost hallowed aura surrounding his personal relics. Beyond the famed transport of his heart to Warsaw, people preserved his letters, locks of his hair, and even the pianos he played. Memorials and statues appeared, especially after political shifts allowed Poland to honour its favourite son openly. festivals sprang up celebrating his birthday and revisiting his repertoire. A certain romantic mystique enveloped his image, the frail poetic exile whose life and death paralleled the vulnerable beauty of his music. Yet for all the mythologizing, Chopin's legacy rests squarely on the strength of his compositions. They remain staples in concert halls and teaching studios, prized not only for their emotive power, but also for their technical demands. Students labour over the waltzes, nocturnes, and etudes, learning to tell stories through rubato and carefully weighted chords. Seasoned performers return to them repeatedly, finding fresh nuance with each pass. In every corner of the world, from grand theatres in major capitals to modest community recital spaces, Chopin's notes continue to ring out, bridging gaps in language, culture, and time. Through it all, the composer retains an aura of intimate mysticism. His music, often described as capturing the soul's gentle confessions, remains deeply personal to each interpreter. And that may be his greatest gift to posterity, the invitation to find our own unspoken yearnings mirrored in his quietly revolutionary idiom. He left no grand manifesto, no flamboyant stage persona, but rather a carefully wrought tapestry of sound that persists in reminding us how powerful the softest voice can be when it speaks of truth. In the modern age, Chopin's significance endures, transcending the boundaries of Poland and France to captivate listeners worldwide. Yet the way we understand him today has expanded well beyond the initial romantic framework. Scholars delve into his manuscripts, tracing the evolution of harmonic progressions and fingering patterns. Historians consider the political and social milieus that shaped him, noting how exile sharpened his sense of cultural identity. At international piano competitions, from Warsaw's prestigious Chopin competition to events in Asia and the Americas, contestants vie to interpret his works with the perfect blend of fidelity and personal insight. In Poland, Chopin remains a national treasure. Streets, airports, and music schools bear his name. The annual festivals dedicated to his music attract visitors from every continent, turning the performance of nocturnes and ballades into a communal pilgrimage. His heart, encased in a pillar at the Church of the Holy Cross in Warsaw, is a poignant reminder of his last wishes. Locals and tourists alike pause there, reflecting on a life that, despite its brevity, resonates across centuries. The Poles see in Chopin a symbol of resilience, a testament that beauty can thrive even under oppression. In France, his longtime adoptive home, Chopin's legacy flourishes as well. Visitors to Paris can pay homage at Père Lachaise Cemetery, where he rests among luminaries such as Jim Morrison and Oscar Wilde. In the city's music academies and concert halls, his name is spoken with a reverence reserved for those who shaped an era. His image, the elegantly dressed yet fragile composer, forever perched at a piano, persists in cultural memory. Each year, recitals commemorate his arrival in Paris, recalling the sense of astonishment he once sparked in those crowded salons. Meanwhile, interpretations of his music have branched in countless directions. The early decades of the 20th century saw pianists like Ignacy Jan Paderewski champion his work with a grand romantic flourish. Later, Artur Rubinstein emphasized an elegant simplicity, stripping away sentimental excess. Contemporary virtuosos, bolstered by historically informed performance techniques, debate over pedal usage and tempo rubato, chasing an elusive authenticity that might approximate Chopin's own sound. Yet the essence of his composition resists rigid definition. Each generation finds something new in them, an unexpected harmonic pivot or a melodic gesture that resonates with modern ears. While classical music circles revere Chopin, other genres occasionally claim him too. Jazz pianists adapt his harmonies, weaving his chordal language into improvisations. Film composers borrow snippets of his melodic style to evoke nostalgia or refined emotion. Even pop and rock musicians have paid tribute in their ways, sampling themes or referencing him as a beacon of artistic integrity. That a 19th century Polish expatriate continues to surface in such varied contexts underscores the universal pull of his sound. At the same time, fresh biographical insights continue to surface. Historians have unearthed letters and diaries that shed light on his experiences in exile, his struggles with illness, and his sometimes overlooked humour. Discussions of his personal relationships, particularly his partnership with George Sand, have shifted from scandalized whispers to nuanced examinations of how two creative forces can both nurture and wound each other. Modern scholarship probes the idea that Chopin's poor health was not merely a tragic backdrop, but a driving factor in his artistry, compelling him to distill profound emotion into concise forms. One cannot overlook the importance of nostalgia and memory in Chopin's ongoing allure. His nocturnes, waltzes, and mazurkas possess a wistful quality that resonates with anyone who's experienced love and loss, yearns for home, or contemplates the transient nature of life. That sense of longing, so central to the Romantic era, feels surprisingly fresh in a world where technology often accelerates our daily existence. Through Chopin's music, many listeners find a space to breathe, to contemplate subtler shades of emotion less easily expressed in words. In a sense, the Chopin story is a bridge between epochs. He lived in the age of candlelit salons and quill-penned letters, yet his art continues to find renewed relevance. Grand competitions see young pianists from Seoul, Buenos Aires, Cape Town, and beyond interpret his scores with riveting originality, proving that music transcends geography and time. The constant reimagination of his work through performance, scholarship, and even casual listening testifies to the enduring power of a gentle soul who spoke most eloquently when seated before a piano. From Zhelezova Wola to Paris and back again, Chopin's journey resonates as a narrative of exile, creativity, love, and loss. He remains a figure both deeply cherished and endlessly debated, his spirit woven into the collective memory of Western culture. Each generation rediscovers him on its terms, drawn in by music that whispers truths about the human condition. And thus, Frederic Chopin lives on, a quiet but potent force, reminding us that even the softest voice can reverberate through history. Imagine yourself sitting comfortably in what would have been Africa 6 million years ago, but now it's just a lovely neighbourhood with plenty of trees and no property taxes. Like the first parkour enthusiasts in nature, your distant relatives, really distant, like the kind you only see at evolutionary reunions, are having the time of their lives swinging from branch to branch. Your early ancestors had it worked out. Trees offered food, cover, defence against large teeth, and a great place to observe how other primates swung. Up there in the canopy, where the only big decisions were which fruit looked the ripest, and if it was worth investigating that rustling in the next tree over, life was good. Then, however, something began to occur that would alter everything. The atmosphere started to change, much like when your favourite restaurant gradually alters its menu until you can no longer recognise anything on it. After millions of years, the verdant forests began to disappear. Like houses in a suburban development that became a bit too ambitious with the lot sizes, trees became less common and more dispersed. You understand the issue your ancestors faced if you have ever attempted to move from one tree to another when they are slightly too far apart. It's like attempting to cross a creek from one stone to another, only instead of getting wet feet, you run the risk of becoming someone's lunch. When the next handhold was 20 feet away through open grassland, the traditional swing and grab technique wasn't working so well. Thank you very much. Some of your relatives have chosen to continue living in the woods, doubling down on their arboreal lifestyle. For example, they insist on using flip phones because they are reliable. It's actually good for them that these became the ancestors of modern apes. They stayed in their niche. However, others, your specific branch of the family tree if you will, began to spend more time on the ground. Initially, this was most likely merely a practical requirement. A short walk across the increasingly common grasslands was the only way to get from this patch of trees to that patch of trees. It wasn't particularly effective, but it was manageable to crawl across open ground. Imagine attempting to crawl across a parking lot. You can do it, but it will take some time and you will draw strange looks. Furthermore, you could only see what was right in front of your nose while you were down in the grass, which could be anything from a pleasant patch of clover to something that thought of you as a walking appetizer. When the solution began to take shape, it was both sophisticated and a little absurd. Getting to your feet. Simply getting to your feet. Like a meerkat that chose to adopt it as a way of life instead of merely a fast lookout tactic. Naturally, this was not an impulsive choice. Contrary to what some cartoons may portray, evolution does not operate in that manner. It was more akin to a very slow experiment that occurred over hundreds of thousands of years, making it perhaps the longest-running trial period in history. No one woke up one morning and thought, you know what, I'm going to try this walking thing. The initial attempts at upright walking were likely as graceful as a toddler skating on ice, uncertain, wobbly, and involving a lot of falling. However, there were benefits to even those early uncomfortable steps. You could see over the grass, identify opportunities and threats from a greater distance, and appear much more impressive to potential mates if they were attracted to someone who was constantly falling over, which they apparently were. Really, your ancestors were pioneers. They were trying something entirely different, something no primate had ever tried on a regular basis. Since they were the first to try eating cheese, it seemed strange and dangerous, but it ended up being a really smart move. You were there, or more accurately, your grandparents were there, making their first hesitant forays into the world of bipedalism. And believe me when I say that those initial steps were more like, please don't let me fall on my face again, than giant leap for mankind. The problem with standing up, though, is that you start to realise how beneficial it is once you start doing it on a regular basis. It's similar to realising you've been living in a soft-focus world and finally cleaning your glasses. The scenery suddenly opened up. You could track where your family members had gone, find the best routes to those strewn trees, and spot predators from a distance instead of just seeing grass and the occasional antelope ankle. Although the visual advantage was enormous, the learning curve was as steep as the hiking trail of a mountain goat. It's like going from riding a bicycle with training wheels to performing in Cirque du Soleil. Your ancestors had to learn how to balance on 2 feet instead of 4. The amazing little organ that prevents you from falling over when you stand up too fast, the inner ear, had to recalibrate itself from the ground up. As you read this, consider all the small muscles and movements your body performs to keep you standing. Like a driver on an icy road, your brain is continuously making micro-corrections, swerving into tiny skids that you aren't even aware of. All of this was something your ancestors had to create from the ground up, making what was basically a full-time job of not falling down into something that just happened. It was a revolutionary hands-free advantage. Your hands are essentially prime real estate taken up by the unglamorous task of moving when you're knuckle walking. But when you get up, your hands are free to do other things. Instead of eating the food right away, like some sort of prehistoric fast food experience, you could take it home to your family. Humanity's first step toward becoming the creatures that would eventually collect everything from stamps to old lunchboxes was likely the ability to pick up and examine interesting objects. The use of tools was made possible in previously unimaginable ways. Chimpanzees can fish termites out of a mound with a stick, but they are unable to transport an entire toolkit. Humanity's first mobile workshops were made possible by your upright ancestors' ability to gather practical objects like sturdy sticks and rocks. They were similar to prehistoric handymen, but instead of building kitchen cabinets, they worked on survival projects. Another unanticipated advantage was the cooling system. It may seem counterintuitive to stand upright in the African sun. After all, it exposes more surface area to the heat. Even though they weren't aware of it consciously, your ancestors were smarter than that. They increased their exposure to cooling breezes and decreased their exposure to the direct overhead sun by standing up. If you didn't mind looking a little goofy while it was in use, it was similar to having an integrated climate control system. In order to accommodate this new way of life, hairstyles even began to shift. A natural sun hat was created by the body hair remaining thicker on top of the head, but becoming less dense overall. Practical, efficient, and establishing trends that would eventually result in some genuinely dubious hairstyles throughout human history. It was evolution's take on functional fashion. The biggest shift, though, might have been psychological. Your ancestors appeared larger, more impressive, and more substantial when they stood up. This was no small advantage in a world where being a formidable person could mean the difference between being left alone or being someone's dinner. It was the ancient equivalent of dressing nicely for a job interview. It didn't alter your identity, but it did alter how other people saw you. The challenge of surviving in a changing world was the occasion, and your ancestors were literally rising to the occasion. Every shaky step, every successful tree-to-tree crossing, every successful moment of avoiding falling was leading to something never seen before in the history of life on Earth. Now, you might assume that the difficult part was over once your ancestors learned the fundamentals of standing up. You'd be mistaken. It's like assuming you're prepared for the Tour de France once you learn how to ride a bicycle. There was a lot of trial and error involved in the transition from technically possible to actually practical, with a focus on the latter. Over hundreds of thousands of years, significant skeletal changes were necessary for full-time bipedalism. In order to distribute weight evenly when standing erect, your ancestors' spines had to grow curves they had never had before, forming an S. Walking upright without these curves would have been like attempting to balance a pile of books as someone continued to add more to the top. There was a complete renovation of the pelvis, if you will. Apes have long, narrow pelvises that are ideal for supporting a horizontal body, but dreadfully inadequate for supporting a vertical one. In order to accommodate internal organs arranged vertically rather than horizontally, your ancestors evolved wider, bowl-shaped pelvises. After choosing to live on the walls rather than the floors, it was similar to moving all the furniture around a house. Leg bones realigned and became stronger. The knees were able to properly align under the centre of gravity of the body because the thigh bone formed an angle that would make any geometry teacher proud. In order to absorb the shock of heel-to-toe walking, feet changed from being flexible, grasping appendages to rigid platforms with arches. Your ancestors were literally starting over from scratch. This is where things start to get interesting and a little awkward. Humans still have to make trade-offs as a result of all these changes. That slender pelvis that allowed for upright walking. It also greatly increased the difficulty and risk of childbirth. Your female ancestors were effectively making a trade-off between mobility and ease of reproduction, which would have long-term effects on our species. In addition to effectively distributing weight, the curved spine produced weak spots that continue to cause issues. People have been complaining of lower back pain for millions of years. It's not just a modern occurrence brought on by desk work and bad posture. Although they most likely weren't aware of this specific first, your ancestors were pioneers in the field of chronic back problems. In the meantime, the feet that had become so good for walking turned into awful ones for climbing. For grasping branches, those inflexible arches and straight toes that were ideal for covering ground were ineffective. Evolutionarily speaking, your ancestors were burning their bridges by settling for a terrestrial lifestyle with fewer and fewer tree backup plans. Without a doubt, there were many spectacular failures during the learning process. Imagine attempting to flee from a predator after you've only just learned how to walk upright. Imagine trying to negotiate uneven ground while your balancing system is still in beta testing. In essence, your ancestors were relearning how to use their bodies, much like someone recuperating from a serious injury. Only the injury was caused by millions of years of quadrupedal evolution. During this time of transition, children must have been especially entertaining. If you've ever seen a human toddler learn to walk, imagine how unsteady they were. Then, add in the fact that the adults weren't much more stable. Like a group expedition led by people who had never gone hiking before, families most likely moved very slowly and fell a lot. However, they continued because the benefits were becoming indisputable. In this honest business, each generation was marginally superior to the previous one. Offspring with stronger spines, improved balance, or more effective walking patterns had a higher chance of surviving and procreating. Those who were able to learn this strange new way of moving through the world were rewarded by natural selection. Better balance control and spatial awareness were being developed by the brain in tandem with these physical changes. That vital part of the brain that controls movement, the cerebellum, was being thoroughly exercised and improving as a result. As they learned to use their newly acquired abilities, your ancestors were literally growing into their new bodies. Your ancestors had become fairly proficient at this standing up business by this point. They weren't particularly elegant yet. Think functional rather than elegant, but they made real progress by being able to move from point A to point B without constantly embarrassing themselves. The desire to see what lay beyond the next hill, which would forever define humanity, came along with this newfound mobility. Because your ancestors became the ultimate tourists, this is where your family history becomes really fascinating. However, they were exploring completely new continents and establishing the human presence in places no primate had ever seen before, rather than snapping photos and purchasing trinkets. Walking had become so efficient that long-distance travel was no longer just feasible, but also necessary. The world begins to appear as though it is just waiting for you to explore it, once you're able to move quickly and steadily, carry your supplies and food with you, and improve your teamwork skills. This wasn't just a weekend getaway. Your ancestors started the first major human migration out of Africa. In the end, this multi-generational journey would disperse humanity throughout the world. Since walking was their new superpower, they travelled by foot from Africa to the Middle East, Asia, and finally Australia and the Americas. By today's standards, the pace was slow. In a good year, these groups might travel a few miles, stopping wherever resources were plentiful, making temporary settlements, and then continuing on when necessity or curiosity demanded it. It resembled the world's slowest and longest treasure hunt more than a planned expedition, with the treasure being simply finding what was around the next corner. Their ability to walk upright was further honed by the new challenges presented by each new setting. They learned endurance and how to move effectively over sand and stone in the desert. Their sure-footedness and balance were developed in mountainous areas. They were exposed to walking on a variety of surfaces in coastal areas, including sand, rocks and tide pools, all of which required minor adjustments to their balance and gait. Walking's social components gained equal weight with its physical ones. Better communication systems had to be developed in order for groups to coordinate their movements. When you needed to say something like, "There's a river 3 days' walk north that has excellent fishing, but watch out for the cranky hippopotamuses," you couldn't just grunt and point. Language became crucial for exchanging navigational information, discussing route options and organising stops. Walking in groups also meant creating systems of cooperation and social hierarchy. Who determines the speed? Without abandoning the slower walkers, how can you make accommodations for them? When someone is hurt, what do you do? The idea of group travel with all the associated logistical difficulties was essentially being invented by your ancestors. They developed increasingly advanced and specialised tools for their nomadic way of life. Heavy, one-time use tools were preferred over lightweight, portable, multifunctional items. They continuously improved their equipment to strike a balance between portability and functionality, much like prehistoric hikers. A good walking stick became useful not only for stability but also as a measuring tool, a testing ground probe, and a reach extension. When they lived mostly in trees, the weather became a constant factor in ways that it had never been before. Their bodies were more exposed to wind, rain, and temperature fluctuations when they were walking upright. They had to learn how to read weather patterns, plan their routes around seasonal changes, and devise strategies for travelling in various weather conditions. They developed extraordinary navigational skills. They learned to read landscapes like books without the use of maps, GPS, or even written language. Mountain shapes, river flows, vegetation patterns, and animal behaviour all contributed to the development of a complex system for navigating uncharted territory. By establishing patterns of curiosity and movement that would eventually take their descendants to every part of the planet, your ancestors were penning the first chapters of human exploration. With only their ability to walk upright, their developing intelligence and an apparently insatiable desire to see what lay beyond the next horizon, they were the first pioneers. Even your ancestors probably didn't anticipate the intriguing turn your family history is about to take. Their brains were being remarkably impacted by all of this walking, carrying, tool use, and acclimating to new surroundings. It was similar to a very long-term, very slow fitness program, but it was building intelligence rather than muscle. One of the most graceful feedback loops in evolution is the connection between brain development and upright walking. Your ancestors' ability to walk on 2 feet allowed them to use their hands for more difficult tasks. They needed more advanced hand-eye coordination than they had ever needed before in order to use tools, make tools, and carry several objects at once. The really clever part, though, is that the parts of the brain that govern precise hand movements are located directly adjacent to those that govern language and abstract thought. Ideas tend to flow back and forth, much like when your office and workshop are adjacent. Your ancestors were unintentionally creating the neural infrastructure that would eventually enable sophisticated communication and problem-solving as they improved their motor control for using tools. The actual brain was enlarging, but not at random. To meet the new demands of bipedal life, certain areas were growing. Already exerting extra effort to control balance and coordination, the cerebellum kept growing. The frontal cortex, which is in charge of planning and making decisions, grew to accommodate the intricate decisions required for group coordination, tool use, and navigation. Consider the activities that your ancestors engaged in on a daily basis. They had to make and maintain tools, remember where resources were, plan routes through uncharted territory, coordinate group movements, and solve problems that their tree-dwelling relatives had never faced. It was similar to enrolling in a full-time multi-year university course on how to solve real-world problems. Their developing brains were especially taxed by the social components of their new way of life. Cooperation and group travel required not only knowing what you had to do, but also knowing what other members of your group were planning and thinking. The ability to comprehend that other people have their own thoughts, intentions and knowledge, what psychologists now refer to as theory of mind, had to be developed. The importance and sophistication of language were growing. Their lifestyle now required complex coordination, and simple gestures and warning calls were insufficient. The water source they had discovered yesterday, the hazardous terrain ahead, and the travel plans for tomorrow were among the things they needed to discuss that weren't immediately available. Thinking abstractly was turning into a survival tactic. Additionally, your ancestors had to contend with a wider range of difficult circumstances. Every new habitat they came across had its own set of challenges. In a desert, how can one locate water? In a new area, what is safe to eat? In a climate that is colder than anything you have ever experienced, how do you stay warm? In essence, each obstacle overcome served as a teaching tool for innovative problem solving. There was an acceleration of the feedback loop between mental development and physical capabilities. More sophisticated tasks were made possible by better tools, which in turn required even better brains. Better group coordination made possible by more advanced communication allowed them to take on increasingly difficult situations that required more complex planning and problem-solving skills. Most significantly, though, they were acquiring what we might refer to as cognitive flexibility, the capacity to modify their way of thinking in response to novel circumstances. Your ancestors were always facing new problems that needed new answers, unlike their relatives who had discovered and remained in successful ecological niches. They were evolving into the best generalists, able to survive in nearly any setting. Their bodies and minds were becoming uniquely intertwined. Their improved vocal control due to their erect posture aided in the development of their language skills. The production of sophisticated tools made possible by their freed hands promoted the growth of their brains. They were able to plan and coordinate better thanks to their enhanced brains, which increased the effectiveness of their bipedalism. Everything was interconnected, and as one advancement led to another, the capabilities increased. Through intelligence, collaboration, and cultural innovation, your ancestors were essentially evolving into a new kind of creature that could adapt to nearly any environment without the need for specialized physical evolution. They were laying the groundwork for all subsequent stages of human development by exchanging biological specialization for mental adaptability. Your ancestors had been walking upright for well over 1 million years by this time in your family's history. They had also become quite proficient at it. However, in evolutionary terms, being good at it meant that they had figured out the fundamental issue of not toppling over all the time. They now had to deal with the subtler optimization problems, like how to walk more effectively, longer, better, and under more difficult circumstances. Human walking became truly remarkable at this point. Your ancestors were becoming the most proficient long-distance walkers the world had ever seen, not just proficient bipeds. They were evolving into the best hiking experts, able to go far on little effort. They created truly amazing mechanics. When done correctly, human walking is basically a controlled fall. You lean forward a little, catch yourself with your other leg, and then use the momentum to keep moving forward. It functions similarly to a perpetual motion machine driven by muscle coordination and gravity. Walking had become an art form for your ancestors. However, endurance walking was the most advanced development. Your ancestors were able to keep up a steady pace for hours, days, or even weeks, whereas other animals might be faster in short bursts. They learned how to walk long distances with heavy loads, negotiate challenging terrain, and keep up this pace for extended periods of time. They resembled infinite-range biological all-terrain vehicles. This was supported by remarkable physical adaptations. Their leg muscles became incredibly efficient, able to contract repeatedly for extended periods of time without becoming tired. During prolonged activity, their cardiovascular systems developed exceptional capabilities to sustain consistent oxygen delivery. Their feet evolved into highly advanced propulsion and shock absorption mechanisms. The control of temperature became especially complex. Your ancestors' capacity to sweat effectively while sustaining constant activity levels is the most sophisticated cooling mechanism in the mammalian world. In hotter climates, they could walk all day, whereas other animals needed to take cover from the heat. The more they worked, the more effective the built-in air conditioning became. Long-distance walking's psychological effects were equally as significant as its physical ones. your ancestors possessed exceptional mental endurance, which is the capacity to stay motivated and focused during long periods of repetitive work such as hours or days. They developed the ability to pace themselves, find rhythm and flow in prolonged movement, and keep the group cohesive during lengthy travels. Modern explorers would be impressed by the level of navigation skills attained. They were able to plan multi-day routes through unfamiliar territory, remember and return to specific locations after long absences, and maintain direction across featureless terrain without the use of any tools other than their own senses. They gained an intuitive awareness of seasonal variations, natural navigational markers, and landscape patterns. Group long-distance travel required extraordinary social coordination. Throughout possibly weeks of travel, groups had to coordinate rest periods, share the load of carrying supplies, keep their unity, and synchronize their pace. In essence, they were creating the ideas of expedition management, teamwork, and logistics. They developed an extremely complex relationship with the terrain. They acquired the ability to read various ground types and modify their stride for maximum effectiveness on grass, mud, rock, or sand. They created methods for safely traversing through dense vegetation, crossing streams, and walking on steep slopes. Every kind of terrain turned into a puzzle that needed to be solved using walking technique. Their walking lifestyle was supported by the evolution of tool use. Walking sticks evolved into multifunctional tools for testing the ground, determining depth, reaching objects, and offering leverage on challenging terrain. They were no longer only used for balance. More advanced carrying systems that efficiently distributed weight for long-distance transportation were developed. Most significantly, though, your ancestors were acquiring what we might refer to as walking wisdom, an innate sense of rhythm, pace, endurance, and efficiency that would later come to define humanity. In addition to learning how to walk, they were also learning how to walk far, walk well, and make walking a long-term, sustainable lifestyle. They were producing something that had never been seen before in natural history, thanks to their unique blend of physical prowess, mental stamina, social coordination, and technical proficiency in bipedal locomotion. In addition to being animals with the ability to walk upright, your ancestors were developing into the most proficient long-distance drivers the world had ever seen. Millions of years later, you are most likely sitting and reading this, which would have perplexed your early ancestors, who had to go to such lengths to get you upright in the first place. The beauty of the whole story, however, is that your ancestors learned to do more than just stand up and walk. They learned to do it so well that you now have the freedom to decide when to use the amazing skills they acquired. In the end, becoming proficient at bipedalism involved much more than simply moving from one location to another. It turned into the cornerstone of everything that makes people special. Upright posture, improved vocal tract configuration, and breath control, which contributed to the development of language. Hands were released from locomotion, allowing for the use of complex tools. Because group travel and coordination required advanced planning and communication skills, social cooperation developed. Millions of years of walking have left their mark on your brain today. Numerous generations of ancestors who had to negotiate difficult terrain while remaining upright shaped the neural pathways that govern balance, coordination, and spatial awareness. The ongoing difficulties of group coordination and long-distance travel extended the areas in charge of planning and problem-solving. Even the skills your ancestors acquired through bipedalism are essential to your current way of life. You use skills developed over millions of years of upright walking when you move through a crowded area, keep your balance on a moving bus, or coordinate your movements while carrying multiple objects. You have skills that you probably don't think about much but use all the time because of your ancestors' extensive training in staying vertical. Your ancestors' endurance manifests itself in unexpected ways. Among the animal kingdom's top long-distance runners are still humans. Running marathons, hiking, and other endurance sports activate muscles that were evolved for survival, not sport. You possess the genetic heritage of the greatest walkers in the history of evolution. Human interaction is still influenced by the social aspects of your ancestors' walking lifestyle. All human social organization is built on the cooperation, communication, and group coordination skills they acquired for successful group travel. The skills that your ancestors developed while attempting to travel together across ancient landscapes are used in every team project, coordinated effort, and successful group endeavour. Even in our GPS-enabled world, your relationship with the landscape and navigation reflects skills your ancestors developed out of sheer need. Millions of years of evolutionary development in land navigation have given humans the ability to read terrain, comprehend spatial relationships, and maintain direction. Perhaps most astonishingly, however, your ancestors' ability to walk on 2 feet allowed humans to flourish in nearly any terrestrial setting, something no other species has been able to do. Because your ancestors acquired such amazing walking skills and the intelligence to use them efficiently, humans are able to adapt and survive in a variety of environments, from the Arctic tundra to the tropical rainforest, from mountain tops to the ocean shores. Being able to stand up straight was not only a physical accomplishment, it marked the start of human civilization, culture, technology, and language. The foundation your ancestors laid when they first got up and made the decision to remain that way is the basis for all human achievements, from the invention of the first stone tools to space exploration. Take a moment to appreciate the incredible journey that led you to this point the next time you stand up. Really stand up, with your head high, hands free, spine curved just right, and your weight balanced on 2 feet. You are the offspring of creatures that took one of the most unlikely risks in the history of the natural world and made it work remarkably well. You're the result of millions of years of evolutionary experimentation. The ability to stand tall in the world, both literally and figuratively, is a gift from your ancestors. They evolved into beings that made upright walking their defining trait, rather than creatures that occasionally stood up to gain a better view. They transformed a last-ditch effort to adapt to changing conditions into the greatest adventure in human history. You can now sleep soundly knowing that you will be taking part in one of the most successful evolutionary innovations in the history of life on Earth when you wake up and walk for the first time tomorrow. Good walks and sweet dreams.